City of Forbidden Beasts, Book 3 in the Queen's Wraith series. Written by G.K. Lund. Chapter 1. The shade loomed nearby, and though outside it, Nadia Navarra, shadow wraith of the Queen's Wraiths, could almost feel its cruel pull to torment those brave or foolish enough to venture inside. The last of the former category were currently being helped outside by several fellow shield wraiths, the guardians of the Agarthan border to the Shimmer, the gateway to other realms. Nadia went over and helped support the last wounded shield the final few meters to ease the strain on the shield supporting his other side. "Werewolf?" Nadia inquired. The wounded man had 2 long gashes across his abdomen, his black shirt ripped and revealing the long wounds. "Yes," the shield helping said, "but it wasn't Tricandis." They helped the wounded wraith over to the checkpoint station right outside the shade where a medic was helping. More were on their way, but it was clear to Nadia that the 3 wounded shields were thankfully going to make it. They had been banged up badly and had wounds consistent with werewolf attacks on them, but none were deep enough to kill or grievously injure them. Anyone other than wraiths would not have been so lucky. Nadia took a step back to let the medic work while he instructed the surrounding shields to assist him. They all had some basic training in this, but Nadia was one person too many at the moment. Better to stand back until someone needed her. "The convoy is approaching," another shield informed everyone, her voice slightly raised to be heard. Wraiths did not need to shout unless in a combat situation or dealing with unruly humans or magically enhanced citizens. Among themselves, the discipline was practiced from childhood, and it was strong. Everyone got the message. Nadia looked into the shade and saw the beginning of the long convoy emerge from behind a cluster of abandoned houses in there. The dark and pale yellow light inside the shade shrouded everything and everyone in a perpetual dusk while gnawing at travelers' minds, tormenting them, breaking them down. Everyone in that convoy was likely more than ready to leave the shade and enter the city. Outside the shade, the sun shone, reflected through the magical sky to spread its life-giving rays on the underground city of Agartha. The entire city was kept running by the Queen's mages, the descendants of the mages who had ruined the surface and forced the Agarthans below ground to survive. But even the mages, powerful as they were, didn't know exactly what the shade was and what kind of force lay behind it. It was closely connected to the Shimmer, the magic behind the veil, the gateway between realms. Somehow, after the founding of underground Agartha, it had begun to expound from the walls, the natural endpoints of the vast cavern that housed the city. Every decade it widened a few centimeters, eating up whatever was in its way, which left the houses in there in a desolate state, until they became ruins and crumbled. The ground was mostly old cobblestones, and sand closer to the wall. The shade surrounded about half of Agartha, bordering on the farmlands on one end, and the city everywhere else. "Maudian," the shield in charge, Diamira, said. "Yes," the young shield answered and stepped back from the huddled group of wraiths, trying to help the wounded. "Go and divert them over to the next checkpoint. I don't want them seeing wounded wraiths." "Yes," Maudian repeated, and ran inside the shade without a second thought. Like every wraith, he'd been taught many a mental trick of how to ignore the shade and push the incessant torture of it to the back of one's mind. The large trucks stopped when he reached the first one to speak to the driver. Motorized vehicles were not overly common in Agartha, especially trucks. There were a couple of hundred all in all, and most of them belonged to the Queen, used to bring needed goods to the city in from the Shimmer. As an underground city with a poisoned surface above, it was impossible to survive without trade with other realms. Thankfully, Agartha had plenty of minerals and magical knowledge to trade with. Cars and trucks were produced in the city, but were all in some shade of gray and looked a lot more clunky than the cars Nadia had seen on her many journeys earthside. There, cars were smaller, sleeker, more colorful, and faster too. But then, What was the point of speeding when there was nowhere to drive but around the city? Most Agarthans, Wraiths among them, walked everywhere. The trucks were useful, though, and the loads they carried now were of massive metal girders, probably intended for construction work. With limited space, even in a magically excavated cavern, Agarthans built upward to gain more of it. The first truck, upon hearing Maudian's orders, changed direction and drove to pass through the other checkpoint, the others following close behind. Likely, none of the drivers relished a few more minutes in the shade, but no one argued with the Wraiths either. "Apologies for the chaos," Diamira said. She was an older shield, about Nadia's age of 26. Like Nadia and all the other shields around them, she was dressed in dark clothing, the telltale sign of a Wraith in Agartha. They did not have a uniform as such, but wore dark clothes, usually black and dark grays. The clothes varied to the degree they found comfortable, but most wore the long coat of a thin fabric interspersed with wool and a sword at the hip or a short one strapped to their back. Nadia preferred the former. "Hardly chaos," she told Diamira, eyeing the far-off additional medics on their way down the nearest street. They had been running all the way from the cube, the home and base of every Wraith in the city. "Was this not Tracandis, then?" she added. "No, Atherton and his team went inside a few hours ago," Diamira began, and Nadia nodded. Atherton was the shadow Wraith tasked with capturing Tracandis, Nadia's ex-boyfriend from years ago, known to her by his real name, Darrow. "They must have encountered something bad, judging by this. Price said it was a female werewolf." Nadia glanced at Price. He had a gash along the side of his neck. His reflexes and reactions had to be superb for that not to be deeper and deadly, instead of what it was. "Could be a follower," Nadia volunteered. It had become common knowledge among the Wraiths now that Tracandis, the vampire-werewolf hybrid whose mind was like a broken mosaic, was gathering followers and supernatural weapons. What no Wraith understood, Nadia among them, was how an abomination, like a hybrid such as him, could have anyone following him. Vamps and wares disliked each other on principle. There was a reason he was shunned and despised, but Atherton was a skilled Wraith, and he might not have caught Tracandis yet, but he had deduced a lot from his behavior. "Could be," Diamira said. "But Atherton and the others are still inside the shade, so be careful if you're going in." She raised an eyebrow. "Are you? Going in?" "Yes, but I came here to have a word with you, though now might not be a good time." The medics reached the checkpoint, and several shields moved to give them access to the wounded. "Not much I can do here now," Diamira said, and gave a slight shrug. "What can I help you with?" "Flynn." The shield inhaled slowly and then nodded. "I see. You were assigned, then?" "Yes." Nadia had been assigned a new case by Terrace, the half-elven spectre Wraith, their superior who most often dealt with the shadows. Unlike the shields, the shadow Wraiths handled cases of rogue creatures and humans who committed crimes, often in the shade, or they hid there, or they committed crimes in other realms. In every case, they had broken the Queen's law and had to be dealt with accordingly. There was a reason the shadows were commonly known as assassins throughout the city. Flynn was another matter altogether. He was one of theirs, a shield Wraith. "Tell me what you know, please," Nadia said. She had gotten the details from the Spectre, of course, but preferred hearing it from the primary sources if she could. "Not much to tell," Diamira said. "He died last week in the shade, and we did what we had to. We burned his body." "Inside the shade?" Diamira nodded. "We usually take the bodies out, but you know how it is. The shifter who came through from the Atlantis realm went crazy the moment he was hit by the shade. It takes some like that." "Yes." "We didn't have a choice but to follow, so we did. We killed the shifter, and then we hurried back and burned Flynn's body. We figured he'd been there too long already, so we went ahead and did it right there." "Understandable." Usually, the shields would burn bodies outside the shade to give themselves a break and not spend unnecessary time in there, but dead people left in the shade tended to end up haunting the place, and ghosts inside the shade were often more powerful and out of control than other places. "There were reports of him being seen after he died?" she asked the shield. Diamira's blonde braid hung over her shoulder, and she moved it to hang down her back. "Yes, twice now. By Price." She indicated the wounded man with a nod. "And Kearney." That shield was not present at the moment, but it didn't matter. There was no disbelieving the Wraiths in these matters. In most matters, really. From what Nadia knew, she herself was the biggest liar of them all. "Bad news, then," she simply said. If he had been seen, it meant he wasn't quite as dead as believed, and undead people in Agartha, especially in the shade, were bad news, Wraiths or not. "Worse than what was already heavy on our shoulders," Diamira admitted. One of their own had died, and though it happened, they all knew each other from their years as young bolt Wraiths. "Yes, every day may be our last," Nadia said. For the Queen's Wraiths, this was too true. But they also lived and died with the honor of protecting the city from outside and inside dangers. That meant something to every single one of them. "But I lament Flynn's passing. He was a good man." "Yes." They paused then, and stood in silence while watching the other shields get the wounded bandaged and slowly up on their feet. It was a good sign that they could walk back to the cube, albeit with some help from their fellow Wraiths. The scent of their blood hung heavy in the air for Nadia's half-werewolf nose. Inside the shade, the last truck of the convoy drove off after the others. "Keep your eyes out for that werewolf, then," Diamira told Nadia when she asked to be pointed in the right direction, toward the remnants of Flynn's pyre. Soon after, the shade embraced Nadia with the suffocating terrors it always bestowed upon its visitors. As if on reflex, she pushed the horror to the back of her mind and walked on, taking the route Diamira had advised. The cobblestones turned to sand beneath her boots, and the houses became ruins around her by the time she came across the ashes and charcoal left over from the fire. The wall was close, and she knew the shield party had come upon the crazed Lantian shifter near it. The wall rose up abruptly further ahead, but even at that distance, Nadia could see the green and silver shimmer that protruded like blotches in the berg. She focused on the ashes at her feet, though. She readjusted her tight ponytail and then drew her dagger, using the blade to sort through the ashes on the ground. Wraiths knew how to build and maintain proper pyres. It took a lot of heat to break down a body, even with the added energy of phoenix dust, but there would always be traces. It was a good thing that a few fragments of bone did nothing to sustain the angered spirits of the deceased, but no matter how much she went through the ashes, she couldn't locate any. There were none of the white little fragments she expected to find. Nadia sat back on her haunches, confused and worried, yet always on the alert for nearby threats with her enhanced senses. She knew the shade could quickly break such biological matter down, but not in a mere week. No matter how much she wanted this to be different for her fellow and dead Wraith, she knew there was a real chance he was not as departed as expected. Which meant, unfortunately, that she was about to start hunting one of her own. Chapter 2. "Hey, Nadia." The friendly words were uttered close by when Nadia was about to ascend the wide stairs leading up to the front doors of the cube. The building was aptly named, or unimaginatively, depending on how one looked at it, and it rose like a brutal, dark granite colossus that housed the dark-clad Wraiths of the city. On the other side, obscured for Nadia at the moment, lay the royal palace and the palace grounds. The Wraiths seldom went there, though. That was the domain of the Queen's ghosts, her personal bodyguards. None of this mattered to Nadia in the here and now as more than information, and in the case of the ghosts, dreams of a different and freer, yet still purpose-filled life. But even striving to be a ghost was pushed back in her mind when she turned her head and saw Harmiston a few steps away, on his way to work, no doubt. The cube's chronicler was a handsome man, with his lean build, blonde hair, and trimmed beard, but it was most often his friendly eyes and ever-confusing, chattering ways that had Nadia notice him. She couldn't deny that to herself anymore. But with the stack of lies she'd built up since Darrow had returned to Agartha a couple of months ago, and the secret of her daughter hidden away Earthside, getting involved with anyone was a bad idea these days, especially someone so closely connected to the Wraiths that they were working for them. Her position as a shadow already hung from a thin thread. No need to add a sharp knife into the mix. But that was a problem with the cheery and carefree, yet highly competent chronicler. He knew one of those secrets, and he had kept it. Never even mentioned the day-walking vamp Nadia had let go, both because it was the right thing to do, and as a favor to her childhood friend Victoria. They had hardly spoken of it, but he was genuinely of the same opinion that the young man in question had committed no crime, and therefore not deserved to die. No, Harmiston was a good friend, and he needed to remain only that. But of course she waited for him. She'd begun to enjoy his company, to look forward to it. That was not good, and she knew it. But still. "New case?" he asked when he reached her. "How did you know?" "You were about to run inside, but then I've hardly ever seen you sit down for long, so maybe you don't need breaks like the rest of us. Of course, the rest of us, in this case, is everyone in there," he pointed at the cube, "who kind of act the same way. So in conclusion, I mean me and the other chroniclers and assistants who yearn for the couch after a long day at work." Nadia blinked. The words seemed to spill out of him with no effort. Wraiths usually said as little as possible and weighed their words when they did. Growing up in an environment of silent types simply made you one of them. Nadia herself had been an unafraid child, quick to throw snappy remarks around. Like her brother, she'd needed to put up walls to protect herself against the derogatory comments from some of the more cruel, full-blooded werewolves. That attitude had never been beaten out of her. No, there was simply no room for it within the Wraiths, and so it had, like so many things, been pushed to the back of her mind. "I have a new case, yes," she said cautiously. "Flynn." The smile was wiped off Harmiston's face. "Oh, sorry to hear that." "Thanks." Harmiston indicated the doors above, and they began walking up. "I suppose that means something is wrong then. I heard he died. I didn't know him well. I haven't been here that long. But if a dead shield ends up as a Shadows case, then that means his death was suspicious, doesn't it?" "Not his death exactly. That happened just like it was described." "He was surrounded by Wraiths?" "Yes." "And none of them are suspects?" "Hardly." Nadia almost scoffed at the thought as they walked inside. The common area of the Wraiths spread out before them to the side of the front desk. Nadia bypassed that since she didn't have much to go on yet. No need to update the docket with speculations. Instead, she walked over toward the massive interior stairs with Harmiston, navigating between all the Wraiths already in there. Harmiston needed to go downstairs to the library to work, and she needed to go upstairs and find some food in the mess hall after hours in the shade, not encountering any kind of apparition of Flynn. "I'm not so sure," Harmiston said. "I mean, can't Wraiths ever do anything wrong? Not even by accident?" Having children, hiding information about the city's most feared beast, and saving day-walking vamps was definitely in that category, and she'd done none of those things by accident. But Harmiston only knew a third of all that. Besides, Nadia's actions should not lower the standards of all the other Wraiths. "It's rare," she told him. "But all the shields on that job were fully human." "The job that got him killed, you mean?" "Yes." "Huh. Interesting," the chronicler said, and she could see in his eyes that his mind was working hard with this. So, if they were all human, then none of them turned him into something? Correct. But they were all there to burn his body? Also correct. She had talked to everyone except Diamira at the cube before heading out earlier. They all said the same thing. But if this is now a case, then that means his body can't have been destroyed, Harmiston concluded. That is perceptive, Nadia said. Maybe you should consider applying for a chronicler assistant job or something. Harmiston actually stopped himself from talking and stared at her. The twitches of the corners of his mouth were hard to miss, but he managed to not laugh out loud. There was a general murmur around them, from the voices of the Wraiths there, but anything more than soft laughs was rare. You know, sometimes I think you hold back a lot of funny things in that head of yours, he told her with an easy smile. Wraiths don't strive to be funny, she said, her face blank. Harmiston shook his head, the mirth evident in his blue eyes. Anyway, he said, and got back on track. That means a third party was involved. Very likely. Someone who snatched a dead body from a group of watching Wraiths? Yes. He was right. Who could have done that? Yes, the Shields had been grieving their friend and fellow Wraith, but they would never be inattentive inside the shade. Not really outside it either. Something strange had happened to Flynn's body to come out of a pyre unscathed. So the sightings of him? Most likely a ghost, unless he was turned into something before the job in the shade, but that would have been hours beforehand. Wow. And you once asked me why in the realms I wanted to work here instead of for the Queen's ghosts? I still don't understand that, Nadia said truthfully. Unlike him, she would love to work there. Then she could do what she did best, but also acknowledge that she had a daughter. Thankfully, or rather sadly, that was a long time off, since Nell's mad father was roaming the city. He could never know about the sweet little girl that had come from them. Seems there are a lot of things Wraiths don't do, and yet you are far more interesting than the ghosts. That should tell you something about them. I mean, they're so boring, so rigid, Harmiston went on, oblivious to Nadia's secret troubles and wished for life. I'd rather say orderly and disciplined, she argued. Oh, Harmiston said with mock shock, slapping his chest with a flat hand for emphasis. That sounds so tedious. He looked up a moment. Although, in the right circumstances, order and discipline can be fun. He wiggled his eyebrows in jest. Wraiths don't have fun, so I suppose you'll never know. Whoa, was that some flirtatious teasing from a Wraith? Wraiths don't flirt either, she said, completely deadpan, secretly laughing inside. Oh yes, she had too many secrets, small and large. The sound of the front door's opening drew her attention, mostly because it drew everyone's attention. Since every head turned toward the door, Nadia did the same and saw 3 Wraiths enter, Atherton among them. The 2 shields looked worn out and banged up, but at least without the bloody gashes the Wraiths had the checkpoint had gotten. Atherton looked whole, but weary too. The dark-haired man straightened up when Spectre Terrace appeared from behind the front desk and waved him over. Atherton must have taken a serious hit, because Nadia saw him roll his shoulders tentatively, the 2 short swords strapped to his back emphasizing the movement. I do not envy that man, Harmiston said beside her. No? Tasked with hunting down Tricandis, the werevamp hybrid? No, thank you. I've done enough research for Atherton, though, to know that they're going to need magic weapons to succeed. Really? Nadia focused on appearing neutral. Harmiston didn't know he was talking about the father of her child. He probably had no idea Darrow had once been a good person, not a crazed abomination terrorizing the city. Yes, hybrids are rare. I almost thought it was a myth before he showed up a while ago. Harmiston drew his gaze away from the newly arrived Wraiths and back to Nadia again. I hope Atherton and everyone assigned his case makes it out alive. He sighed. I'm not so sure they will. Let's be thankful for ghosts, then. He raised an eyebrow. You think Flynn is a ghost? That is the most likely scenario. I suppose it is, especially inside the shade. Nadia nodded as Terrace caught her eye. The tall blonde man waved her over, and she had little choice but to obey. She found herself reluctant to leave Harmiston's company. That was a bad sign, and though he was about to say something, she indicated the waiting specter and left. It was for the best. Harmiston's company should be enjoyed in small increments to avoid wanting more. It wasn't like she could avoid him anyway because of his position as a chronicler, so she needed to be careful. Atherton had walked away from Spectre Terrace before Nadia reached the half-elf. He didn't leave the cube often like the bolts, shields, and shadows, but like any of them, he was armed to the teeth, the black clothes contrasting with his light-colored hair. His had a colder hue than Harmiston's. Not that that mattered. She chided herself silently. Nadia, Flynn, he said when she was close enough. It doesn't look good, Spectre. His body was not consumed by the pyre. I don't know how it happened, but the sightings of him are probably real. Terrace pressed his lips together and crossed his arms over his chest while thinking. This is not good, he said after a heavy pause. We are already under scrutiny with the Tracandis issue. It's taking too long, and honestly, every murder in the city is attributed to him whether or not he was behind it. Nadia hadn't heard this before. Scrutiny meant the palace, and if they were complaining about the lack of killing Darrow, then the newspaper would pick up on it soon. We don't need anything more negative now. Like the haunting of a dead wraith? She ventured, seeing where this was going. It will look bad, like we don't know what we're doing. I need you to take care of this quickly. Of course, Spectre. A haunting was bad, especially if the ghost was a powerful and angry one. She hoped that wasn't the case. I will make sure Flynn finds peace. Good. He was a hard-working, decent wraith. I dislike the thought of his memory being tarnished. On that, they agreed. I will assign you some shields to speed up the search, Terrace went on. Start in the city where he was spotted. It's rare for the spirits of those who have died inside the shade to appear outside of it, but it happens. It did, but Nadia was well aware of how rare it was. She hoped this was simply a normal haunting, as far as hauntings were normal. But this oddity had her on edge. Chapter 3. Dawn was half an hour away, but streetlights provided enough light to see. Add in the fact that Nadia's predator ancestors had left her with a set of eyes that could see far and also well in the dark. It didn't matter to her which time of day she was out to follow up on a case. Another sighting of Flynn had occurred, and the message had come in late in the evening yesterday. Having eaten, rested, and trained in the gym, she felt she'd been given a luxurious rest between the shade yesterday and roaming the city now, searching for their missing Wraith. Flynn had been spotted in a fairly quiet part of Agartha, where the houses couldn't truly be called that anymore. A few years on, though, and that would change too. With a growing population, apartment buildings of no more than 5 floors were a waste of space. But Flynn had been spotted there by some people who'd reported it to the police. When they had checked it out, they had gone to the Wraiths. That meant that whatever Flynn had been doing, it was strange enough to cause all this attention. The report only stated he'd been behaving erratically, something which both said a little and a lot. Wraiths did not act erratically if they were themselves, but Nadia was well aware that Flynn was not Shield Flynn anymore. He was good at hiding, though. She'd sent the 3 shields Terrace had assigned her out to canvass the area, but as they'd checked in during the night, Flynn had been spotted nowhere. Nadia pushed her braid away to reach into a tiny pocket under the narrow lapel of her long coat when raised voices drew her attention. She stared down the street she was in. No one was out near her, but down at the end, there was movement, and by the sound of it, someone was stressed about something. Very much so. Nadia changed directions and walked toward the voices. They were raised and agitated, but she didn't get a sense of hostility or arguing. There was a particular smell, though. She ventured closer, on the alert, and then sensed it. The scent was of blood, but not any kind. It was stronger and more varied. Powerful, like it was infused with more blood repeatedly. A vampire was bleeding up ahead. "All the silver!" someone uttered when she was close enough to discern the meaning of the words. "How do we get him down without harming him more?" "I don't know. His neck." Nadia frowned. That last voice was familiar, and she sped up. She was right. The moment she entered the little cross-section of streets, she saw Atherton there with a few of his assigned shields. There were a few other people there as well, and they were all gawking up at something. Nadia turned her gaze upward too, and then stopped dead in her tracks. High up on the wall of a high-rise, strung up on a billboard advertising one of the city's newspapers, was the undisputed vampire leader of Nightworth. Azierad Neris was a large figure, not only as the leader of Agartha's vamps but also in stature. His muscular body was strapped to the billboard, arms and legs sprawled, silver chains twirled around him everywhere. The chains were fastened so tightly around his body they drew blood, the crimson drops coloring the silver and dripping down to the street below. His head was slightly bent forward, dark locks hanging down though not concealing the familiar face of the old vampire. He looked worn out and beaten. Someone had taken him down, and forcefully so. "Atherton?" Nadia said, and walked up to the other shadow. "Nadia, what are you doing here?" Atherton looked like he had gotten little rest since the chaos inside the shade yesterday. "Looking for Flynn." A flicker of sadness crossed his face at the mention of their fallen comrade. "Of course. I forgot for a moment there." "No wonder." Nadia indicated the weakened and nearly dying vampire high above them. "Tricandis is doing?" she asked. "Why else would Atherton and his shields be here?" "Has to be." He shook his head in exasperation. "We were tracking one of his followers, a female werewolf, but doing this to Neris? It has to be Tricandis himself." Nadia nodded while considering the vampire with a calm gaze. Neris had ruled the vampires in this city for decades, but he was a few centuries old if the Wraith's file on him was correct. He was old and in vampire terms. This meant he was strong and cunning. Yet now, he was trapped within what appeared to be hundreds of thin silver chains, which burned him and drained blood from him. "We need to get him down then, I suppose?" she asked Atherton. "Yes, he's not wanted for any crime." There was a hint of annoyance in Atherton's voice, much like Nadia felt on the matter. Neris might not be officially wanted for the crime of breaking the Queen's law, but they all knew he drank unsanctioned human blood. Rumors and more credible sources alike claimed he killed his food sources by drinking all their blood, not merely some of it. "I've sent Vitold up to assess," Atherton added and pointed at a nearby ledge where Vitold was indeed approaching the vamp. "Good, because we're drawing an audience," Nadia pointed out. More people were arriving, some from down the streets which crossed there, others coming out of the surrounding buildings. More and more were staring through windows, too. With so many wraiths around, altogether 6, they likely felt safe enough to gawk. "We need to cut him loose somehow," Atherton said. "He seems to be alive." "He is," Nadia confirmed. "His breathing is weak and ragged, but I can hear him." "Right. Have you got gloves?" Nadia nodded. She couldn't touch the silver without them. "Good, because we're going to need all hands for this one. Someone needs to hold him while the rest of us cut him loose." "Yes, he's a big one," Nadia said. "Is his throat cut?" There was more blood around that area, and the vampire seemed to force his head back while struggling to stay conscious. "I believe so. Whatever Tricandis is up to, he wanted Neris to feel this, to incapacitate him, humiliate him." "Then he has succeeded on all fronts," Nadia said. She had to agree with Atherton. She doubted anyone other than Darrow could have done this. Killing a vamp was hard enough, especially one of Neris's stature, but to tie him up like this and render him helpless for all to see? That took a lot of strength. Strength that a were-vamp hybrid possessed. Despite knowing better, it was still hard to fathom Darrow doing this. But then, like Flynn, Darrow was not who he had once been. So, yes, this was likely part of some plan of his. But why? Rumors would spread now, of course. That was unavoidable. Too many had seen. They were still there in the street with Nadia, Atherton, and the Shields watching this public spectacle. Neris's right to rule Nightworth would be severely weakened. So was that the point? To send a message while simultaneously causing fractions within Nightworth? To what end? "Anything?" Atherton shouted up at Witold. He was close enough to have a proper look now, situated on the narrow ledge, right next to an unresponsive Neris. "Yes, I think tying and securing him with a rope will be fine. Then we can cut off all the silver. If we're quick, it should be done before the sun comes out." Atherton told them to get a move on. It wouldn't help the Wraiths, in the long run, to let Neris die, not if they wanted some semblance of peace with his vamps. The rope was requisitioned from a nearby hardware store, and 2 shields began securing the bleeding vampire. With all the silver cutting into his skin, the wounds didn't have time to heal as fast as they normally would. The plan was for 4 of them to go up there and cut the silver. There was no room for more on the ledge on either side of the vampire. Bolt cutters had also been requisitioned from that same store. "This is cutting it close," Atherton told Nadia. "We've been through worse." Atherton's mouth twitched. "I'm not sure Neris has. It's almost disturbing seeing him like this." "Yes, I suppose it takes a monster of a beast to do this." A snapping sound, somewhere behind her, had her freeze. It was not like any of the many noises around her. Whispers, chuckles, shuffling of feet, the soft rustle of fabrics. No, this was something more metallic. "You hear something?" Atherton asked. Since he was a full human, he didn't share Nadia's enhanced senses. He had some slight mage traits, but that was about it, and it didn't help him hear such a weak yet distinct sound. Nadia turned away from the grisly scene of the vampire leader being slowly tortured to death and stared up at the wall of the building behind them. It looked completely normal. There was nothing but windows and a fire escape to see. It was also darkened by the soon-to-be-finished night. Nadia narrowed her eyes. Nadia? She saw Atherton through the corner of her eye, still fully focused on the wall. "Not sure. All right. We're going to start with the silver chains, then." She nodded absent-mindedly, her eyes now only for the seemingly innocuous wall. Then it came again, this little clicking sound. Nadia pinpointed the general area, in the middle of the front of the building, at the same height as Neris on the other side of the intersection of streets. "There's something there," she mumbled, straining her neck to see. There was something uneven right below one of the windows, but it was one of the unoccupied ones. There came no light from within, which made it hard to see. "There's what?" Atherton asked, turning back and forth, trying to see the shields up next to Neris and follow Nadia's line of sight at the same time. "A box?" she murmured, trying to get a grasp of the angular shape fastened to the wall. The clicking noise came again, and a bright blue light appeared. "Bomb!" Nadia shouted before finishing an inhale, effectively hindering her voice to carry. Atherton didn't hesitate, the word reaching him where he stood right next to her easy enough. "Shields! Bomb!" he roared when Nadia was about to repeat herself. Before any of the bystanders could react or take in the word, Nadia and Atherton hit the ground, rolled, and sought shelter near the wall. The other shields did the same without hesitation, Witold backing up from Neris. It was one of the reasons Wraiths didn't normally yell, because when they did, every Wraith knew to react instantly. Screams rose then, the word bomb finally having an effect. The stampede which followed was short-lived, though, because the explosion that followed was soundless. From directly below it, there were too many ledges and sills to allow Nadia to see it, but she heard the metal being blown out. Then followed the most magnificent display of light, bright to the point of burning everyone's eyes. The rays shot across the street and hit the opposite building. Nerys was awoken from the painful hit. UV lights, Nadia realized while shielding her eyes and just barely seeing what was happening. A guttural cry of pain broke through the screams of the bystanders, effectively silencing them as they realized they were not being blown up. It was Nerys screaming in pain, unable to avoid it. The beams of UV light hit his body and smoke rose, his flesh burning under all the silver. His scream rose into the shriek of vampires when enraged, but the pain in his was palpable. He twitched and writhed, the massive muscles trapped there straining to be free. A few of the silver chains even broke at the strength, but there was no escape. With the UV light not being equal in strength to the real thing, it took the powerful vampire leader a full minute of torturous agony to die. They saw his flesh burn while he was alive, his screams only dying when his corporeal shell turned to bone and ashes that floated down, the silver chains slumping from the wall they were fastened to. "Oh," Atherton uttered, breathing fast from the scare and then the shock of the vampire leader's gruesome death. Nadia stared in disbelief, her pulse pounding harder too. She knew what she'd seen, but what had that truly been? Someone had wanted Nerys to die, and spectacularly slow and in public, for all to witness. This was a monstrous thing to do. She turned to Atherton to say something, but her words were cut off from new screams rising around them. It was the same shrieking screams of vampires when enraged, and this time there was no torment from UV light in them. This time, all Nadia heard was the unmistakable call for vengeance. Chapter 4. The vampires had the same effect on the small crowd gathered around Nerys's ashes that the shouts announcing a bomb had. They screamed and started panicking. Nadia, Atherton, and the other Wraiths had a hard time running the opposite way when the crowd ran to escape. The vampires, 4 of them as far as Nadia could see, wore open masks of anger on their faces. They were also showing their true vampiric forms, reminiscent of waxy corpses with their fangs out and the dead and angry stares from their cold blue eyes. Nadia sidestepped several people in her way, noting Atherton doing the same somewhere to her right. The nearest vamp was smiling his grisly smile toward a young woman who'd fallen. Nadia had already drawn her sword, but swinging it too soon would more likely lop off a human's head than a vamp's. She swung to the side, elegantly avoiding a screaming man. His terrified face went past Nadia in a second, and then there was nothing but air between her and the vamp. But he was already bearing down on the woman. Nadia threw herself forward, moving her sword in an inelegant upward motion which made her blade slice into his forearm, the elongated claw-like nails of the vamp too close to the woman. She had fallen and was desperately trying to crawl backward, her dress impeding her desperate movements. Thankfully, Nadia's blade was inlaid with silver, and the pure metal caused him more harm than the shallow cut would have if not. The vamp hissed and halted, clutching at his arm, his ice-blue eyes seeking out Nadia. Good. That meant he was forgetting about his prey. The woman turned over and crawled into an upright position before running, while Nadia got her bearings back from the awkward swing of her sword. The vamp hissed at her, and he wasn't the only one. With the 3 shields on the other side of the intersection, one of them on his way down from the ledge on the wall, Nadia and Atherton were cut off. She saw him parry the strike of a sword from one vamp, another one approaching, and they moved fast, preternaturally so. Some vamps were even known to levitate, though, thankfully. These were not among those. Nadia got Atherton's attention at the moment he sought hers as well. They swung around and met the oncoming vamps back to back. All the vamps were armed, It was said that they often carried swords because of the Wraiths. With the Queen's Guard's affinity for silver-inlaid weaponry, meeting a sword with an undead hand would hurt more than usual. Nadia met the vamp closest to her head-on, parrying his swing at her, the sound of colliding metal prevalent all around her. She saw the shields reach them and attack from the other side. 6 Wraiths against 4 vamps should be possible. The vamps had to know this. She could fathom nothing but them being completely loyal to Nerys for this rage to steer them so foolishly. Nadia ducked, avoiding having her head chopped off. She twisted sideways to avoid the vamp's backswing when she was unable to strike back and shouted a heads-up for Atherton. He leaped forward, and the vamp's sword hit the cobblestones. Nadia swung back and shoved her elbow into the vampire's teeth. It hurt her more than him, but he staggered back from the impact, allowing her to glide seamlessly back into position with Atherton at her back. She launched a kick at the vamp before he could attack again, and it had him reeling backward, right into the silver-inlaid sword of Vitold, who finally reached them. The sword pierced through the vamp's chest, and he never screamed in pain because Vitold had sent the blade through his heart. The vamp blazed hot and began smoldering into ashes, still held up by Vitold. One of the nearby vamps halted his movements at this sight. The sun was breaking through as well now. Nadia darted toward him, just when he both noticed the oncoming light and the shield wraith to his side, fighting one of the vamps going toward Atherton. Nadia had a split second before the beast would spot her, but she landed steadily and swung her sword with all her might. The resistance of sinew and bone was nothing to a trained wraith, and the vamp's head was cleaved almost clean off. Gravity finished the job for her when the head toppled to the side and fell to the ground. The body burned fast and turned to ashes before it fell. "Thanks," the shield said, and then promptly turned toward Atherton, but he was busy finishing off a vamp himself. One of his swords held the vamp in place by being planted deep in its stomach. By the time Nadia looked, Atherton was pushing his other sword through the hissing vampire's chest. "No!" the vamp managed and then smoldered into ashes, freeing Atherton and his sword of the burden. Nadia scanned the area, looking for more threats. She noticed a 5th vamp, though this one kept out of reach, following the spectacle from a nearby street. There was a smile on her waxy, corpse-like face. Then she turned back into her human form, revealing her to be a red-haired woman. Nadia frowned. The creature seemed to be too pleased in either form. Did she have anything to do with this? Another chop behind Nadia stole her attention. It turned out to be Echo, one of her assigned shields, wrenching her sword out of the last vamp's chest, while Vitold helped hold him down. He quickly let go to spare his hands any burn wounds. For a moment, no one spoke. Nadia glanced over toward the red-haired vamp again, but she was gone. Then Nadia looked to Echo. "What are you doing here?" "Came to find you, but heard the noise," the shield explained. "You came looking for me?" Nadia found a black handkerchief in a pocket and wiped down her blade with it, much like the other wraiths around her did. It was a calming exercise after a fight, which they all performed often in their lives. They were all ears for more threats, but with dawn finally breaking, vamps would not be more troublesome at the moment, including the red-haired one. "Yes, I spotted Flynn," Echo said. That stopped them all short, and they stared at her. "Are you sure?" Nadia asked. "Yes, I'd recognize him like I'd recognize all of you." Fair enough, Nadia thought. They had all grown up together, or helped train younger wraiths. They all knew each other. "I lost him, though," Echo hastened to add. Why else would she be here? "Where?" Nadia sheathed her sword and walked over to the other wraith. Echo informed her while looking around at the cross-section of streets. "What happened here?" she asked. There were piles of ashes and bones, as well as the occasional shoe and garment dropped when people had fled. Nadia looked up at the buildings around them and saw they were still being watched, but only by the people behind glass now. "They'll inform you," she said, indicating the other wraiths. "Stay here and help with whatever Atherton needs." She received a thankful nod from the other shadow. He understood why she needed to go. Flynn was Nadia's case and one that hurt the Wraiths. She might be given help, but in the end, it was all up to her. Besides, Atherton needed the help more at this point. Nadia briefly informed him of the spying female vampire and then headed back into the neighboring streets to continue her original search. She controlled and monitored her breathing, making sure her body calmed down without crashing after the adrenaline kick from the UV bomb and the subsequent vampire attack. Freaking out after surviving attacks, whether mundane or supernatural, was not a luxury the Wraiths had. There was always another case. The streets were fairly empty at this point, especially in a residential area. There were shops on the street-level floors, as was usual in Agartha, but they were more specialized, like antique bookstores or delicatessens. None of those were open yet. The few people who passed Nadia were on their way to work in other parts of the city, all casting furtive glances in her direction. Wraiths never did much to draw attention, but the dark clothing they all wore marked them for anyone to see, and a Wraith walking down a quiet street meant they were there for a reason, looking for those who caused unduly trouble. Despite Wraiths harming no one without cause, most people saw them as little more than assassins, especially the shadow Wraiths, who were in many cases exactly that. So yes, Nadia was used to the caution and circumvention from strangers who didn't know or trust her. It was better in crowds. People seemed to think Wraiths less likely to harm them if there were many witnesses. Nadia spent the next hour feeling the sun rising and wakening the city around her. She encountered the other two shields on her walk and sent them Atherton's way. Though assigned to her, Wraiths could make decisions in the field if they saw a more important way to divert resources, and right now, people were shivering in fright because of Tricandis. Nairis had been publicly and spectacularly executed with dozens of witnesses. It had all been a message to everyone who needed to know what he was capable of, and given the speed of gossip and news, that meant the whole city would soon know. Nightworth would become a chaotic and angered stronghold of the city's vamps. No, it was the right thing for Nadia alone to search for the spirit of their fallen comrade. Ghosts rarely appeared in bright sunlight, but unlike vampires, nothing was preventing them from doing so. If Flynn had appeared in this area, then it was likely it was important to him, especially since he'd died in the shade, a place which usually attracted ghosts. Nadia stopped and glanced around. What would be important enough for Flynn to haunt this place? There were even a few parks or sizable gardens between some buildings. It was a pleasant enough space, but he'd lived most of his life in the Cube, across town. It made little sense to her, and she noted she needed to check out his past some more upon her return to the Wraith headquarters. Maybe he had been born here and lived here until he joined the Wraiths. It seemed like the most plausible explanation, until she came across her first trace of him. Nadia didn't expect to smell much regarding a ghost unless it was the smell of sulfur, but that didn't always happen. Regardless, the smell which now assaulted her nose was not that of sulfur. It was sweet and sickening, reminiscent of rotten fruit, but worse. She stood still, taking in every sound, every sight, but the area was still quiet. The few people at a distance were not the cause of this, and Nadia, a seasoned Wraith with an enhanced sense of smell, knew what she was smelling now. It was the unmistakable and unforgettable smell of rotting flesh, more notably that of rotting human flesh. She frowned. The smell was distinct and sharp to her nose, but not overpowering. Echo had not mentioned this, so maybe she hadn't been able to smell it. She had spotted Flynn some 10 minutes away from where Nadia was now standing. Since Nadia was looking for a ghost and a body, this clue was too obvious to ignore. She pinpointed the direction it came from and began tracking it. If Flynn's body had been taken here and hidden somewhere in this neighborhood, then her ghost problem could be solved by finding it and destroying it. That would leave the mystery of who had taken his body to begin with, but that should be handled secondly anyway. Nadia swallowed hard and focused, determined not to let the increasingly putrid smell derail her. At this point, it was strong enough for a human to notice it too. She was getting closer, and closer meant entering one of the public gardens between a couple of 4-story apartment buildings. That was when her ears picked up the sound of rustling leaves, like someone was passing by bushes, not caring about the sound they made or the thin twigs which snapped. Nadia canted her head as she approached, but didn't slow down. Instead, she sped up and rounded the corner of the nearest building. It was only her heightened vision that allowed her to notice the details of the figure on the other side of the garden. The worn and dark clothes that looked so familiar on Flynn, his stilted movements, his disregard for his surroundings, plowing ahead like a machine. It was him. She had no doubt of that, even from the brief glimpse of him in profile before he turned the corner and vanished for her, but not before she saw worn and fringed pant legs on him that were oozing from wounds that were not healing. They were rotting. She knew where the smell came from. If she'd been prone to soliloquies, it wouldn't have mattered. She was too upset and surprised to utter a word, but not so much as not to follow him. Nadia ran into the garden, passing every bush and flower without impact or a sound. When she rounded the same corner as Flynn, she entered a quiet street similar to the one she'd come from. He was gone. Nowhere to be seen. Even the smell had disappeared for the most part. Only a remnant lingered, telling her she hadn't been seeing things. But what she had seen was enough to rattle even a hardened shadow wraith. Her adrenaline was spiking again, her heart beating faster. She had her hand on the hilt of her sword, trying to make sense of what she thought she had witnessed. "Necros," she whispered, sidestepping her wraith habit of not speaking to herself. But it was too far-fetched to believe. She needed to ground her discovery in something, and speaking the name of the undead out loud helped solidify it for her. "Oh, Flynn," she added in the secret confines of her mind, "you need help." Chapter 5. Nadia's steps echoed slightly in the massive hall that made up the principal part of the cube library. Since that was where she was, her home, she didn't bother with walking without a sound. Besides, it seemed to rattle the chroniclers and their assistants when she did. One of the latter group lifted her nose from a book she was reading behind the large, circular front desk and nodded to her left. "He's in the lab." Nadia stopped and eyed her. "Why do you say that?" "You're here for chronicler, right? Harmiston?" Nadia frowned. "Kind of like your usual at a bar?" the assistant said. There was no trace of mockery on her face or in her voice. Wraiths were free to do what they wanted, except get married and have families, but Nadia thought it best to keep a low profile these days. If no one was curious and started paying attention and digging, then that was best. This comment, from an assistant who didn't even know her, meant she was not invisible. It didn't matter that the assistant genuinely didn't seem to care one way or the other. She was merely stating something obvious. Nadia was spending a lot of time with Harmiston, always going straight to him for even simple things an assistant could help with. It was all there beneath her words. Nadia managed as a loud and soft pop sounded to her left. They both swung around when an explosion of pink and golden bubbles emerged atop a bookcase. "By the spirits!" the assistant blurted and jumped up, dropping her book on the desk. "Again? I thought we caught them all." Then she ran off to take care of it with a, "Those bubbles wreak havoc on old books." That was probably meant for herself, not Nadia. Nadia simply took a right and walked over toward Harmiston's lab, keeping quiet about the fact that she had been partially responsible for the mass escape of the magical Agad Agama lizards into the library in the first place. She also had a far more serious problem to handle. This was not trivial, so she could hardly be faulted for asking Harmiston for help. That was his job. "Hey, Nad," he said, looking up with a smile before turning his head down at something glowing in a glass dish. "How's the case?" Nadia stopped short a second, thrown by his use of her shortened name. Her closest friends and family used it, but hardly anyone else. It left her not offended, she realized, merely warm. She shook her head and focused. It's going badly, I think. Harmiston's brows creased as he looked up again. Flynn is a necros. A what? A necros. Harmiston put down his tools and stepped away from the workstation. No, I heard you. I've just never heard of such a thing here before. Because it's illegal, Nadia pointed out. Many things are, and they still exist, like vamps sucking blood from unwilling people. I meant I didn't think the know-how even existed in Agartha. I barely learned about this at uni. What can I tell you? Nadia gave a slight shrug and closed the door to the lab. No one needed to overhear these sad news and spread them through the cube. The specters could decide how to reveal it to the rest of the Wraiths. I saw Flynn's reanimated corpse moving around, his body rotting. He is a reanimated dead body. That's worse than a ghost. It certainly is, Harmiston agreed, seeming to conclude that Nadia was right. And why would she lie about such a thing? Wait here, he said, and then opened a closed door at the other end of the lab. Nadia knew it led downstairs from their shared trip underground over to the royal palace a few weeks back, but also that one first had to pass through several storage rooms for books and archives. It took about 30 minutes before he returned, a stack of around 10 books in his arms, most of them looking old and moldy. Whatever he'd been looking for, those particular books were rarely handled and had probably not been easily accessible. You can sit down, you know, he said when he stepped inside and closed the door with a backward kick. I'm fine, she said. She'd been standing in the same spot since he left. The Wraiths learned early on how to rest their bodies, even when standing. Yes, I'm sure you are. But see, I get tired of watching all of you at attention all day. I mean, do you ever take breaks? He unloaded the books onto a free workstation and began sorting through them. All the time. Harmiston narrowed his eyes playfully as he peered at her a second. Really? Because your resting looks exhausting. Nadia walked over to the nearest chair, pulled it out from under a desk, and sat. Better? Mm-hmm. He nodded and then seemed to vanish into the books he'd brought. Nadia sat for long enough to begin meditating to do something useful with her time, all the while thinking she might as well have done this while standing upright. It was about an hour later that he interrupted her meditative state by clearing his throat. At least she thought it an hour. She could have used the time for more than meditation. She could have gone to the gym, the swimming pool, eaten some food, reported to Spectre Terrace, and yet she felt a sort of ease at waiting around while Harmiston found information that would help her. He was easy company, even in silence. Less bewildering, too. So this is what I could find out in such a short time, he began. Nadia opened an eye and then raised her head fully and focused on him. Did you fall asleep? Meditation, she explained, clears the mind of turmoil. It truly did. By the time he had spoken, she had processed the events of the early morning, cleansing her mind and body of the dark happenings, readying herself to move on. Of course it does, said the man who'd been lost to the world while sifting through ancient books. It made Nadia smile on the inside. An Agad Agama just exploded in the library, and you find meditation remarkable? Harmiston winced at the mention of the creatures. He was partly to blame for their release among the books, too. No, he admitted. Just how much more than fighting that the Wraiths learn growing up. So do the ghosts. Yes, but they're not talkative or open on most matters, including their lives. Sounds very professional, Nadia offered. It did not sound horrible to her ears. So much silence, said the chronicler to that, sounding like he was telling her of a nightmare. Nadia smiled her calm smile, and Harmiston cleared his throat again. So, yes. Necros, he added and got to it. They're real, all right. I already told you that. I know, and I believe you. There simply haven't been any cases in centuries. Certainly not here below ground. All the references I found were a few cases from the surface and then some Earthside ones. They have no magic to do this Earthside. True, and these references are as old as the Agarthan ones, from before magic disappeared Earthside. All right, go on. Necros. I'm not sure that term is in use there any longer. I watched some Earthside movies not long ago, and apparently reanimated corpses are popular as entertainment. But they're called zombies now. Does that help us? Nadia asked. Not really, no. I digressed. But the myth seems to have survived even there. Just with different terms. Vampires are also called bloodsuckers, Nadia pointed out. Monstrous beasts have many names, yet they remain the same. True, and the name doesn't matter as much as what they are. Dead bodies awakened to wander among the living. That's horrifying enough. But the real monsters here are the necromancers. Those who conjure the dead to wake and walk? Harmiston nodded, then looked at her with open curiosity. How did you know that? Wraiths must be prepared for any possibility. Harmiston opened his mouth in an unspoken question. We learn it in school, probably our first year as bolts. He blinked then and shook his head. Suddenly I find my education somewhat lacking. We also learned how to kill them, burn them, or destroy the head. Seems about right, Harmiston agreed, still halfway skimming through some text while keeping the conversation going. You already know a lot. No, I don't. Is Flynn? Harmiston paused his reading, catching on to her meaning. That's unclear, but I don't think so if you're asking if he's in there. The necromancers are described as especially strong warlocks with the ability to control corpses, not anyone's minds. From what I can tell, what you saw was an empty shell, so to speak. He gave her an apologetic look. Don't worry about it. An empty shell is better than one of us being tormented like that. She got up from the chair and walked closer, though stopped at a proper distance to him. What can you tell me about the necromancer? Necromancers use their powers to coax their victims back to life. It never works. According to the references here, they use them for different things, mostly as servants. There also seem to be some cases of addiction to the process, like a growing hunger for power. I suppose one would feel slightly intoxicated if one had just cheated death. Harmiston? What? Oh, yes. He focused on the book again after spacing out a little. The ultimate goal is a bit like alchemy and being able to create gold. You mean they're trying to perfect the process? She asked. Yes. The goal would be to wake someone to a living state, not a mere necros. This is why necromancers are feared and reviled. They can never bring back what people want, only a rotting, mindless shell. Nadia considered this. The main goal might be less than evil, but it was a waste. Dead things did generally not do well when undead from her experience, and every wraith with her. How is it done? Harmiston picked up a book he'd bookmarked earlier. Rituals. Long-winded rituals, often alone or together as a group. You mean there can be more than one necromancer in the city? It depends on the level of sophistication, strength, and know-how of the necromancers. Waking the dead is not a quick and easy process. I suppose it's a question of what they want. Well, the most pressing question is, why would someone do this to Flynn in particular? Nadia couldn't fathom it. The answer to that is not in any of my books, unfortunately. Harmiston closed the one he was holding and put it down. No, but luckily we are where Flynn lived his life. I'll have to start here. If anyone knew anything about him, it would be other wraiths. They all knew each other, but as was natural in any large gathering of people, some knew each other more. Flynn had not been one of Nadia's close friends among the wraiths. She liked him well enough, and trusted him like she did any other Wraith. But that was it. Diamira, on the other hand, was one of his close friends within the cube. "I don't know what to tell you," she said after Nadia had tracked her down in the mess hall. The tray in front of her was empty of food, since Nadia had come across her right when she was done with her meal. "Flynn was like anyone here, an open book. I can't think of anything he'd be involved with that would warrant someone to steal his body." She pursed her lips, but then shook her head. "We were right there. Kearney lit the fire himself. There was magic involved." "What kind of magic? We might be fully human, all of us, but we've been trained well enough to detect some of it." "I know. This is a rare kind of magic." Diamira looked at her, the unspoken question clear. "I can't say," Nadia admitted. "It will be up to Spectre to do that." Diamira nodded, the disappointment clear, but she would not argue a Spectre's decision. Nadia also had more urgent matters with a Necros on the loose than to answer everyone's questions. This was so rare in Agartha, there would undoubtedly be a whole host of them. "Well," Diamira said, and leaned back on her chair. "The only outside connections Flynn had was his girlfriend, I guess." "Fling or actual long-term girlfriend?" Nadia asked. Wraiths tended to have one or the other. Relationships within the organization happened, but always became uncomfortable for the couple and everyone else when they invariably ended. Most Wraiths learned quickly to avoid those kinds of liaisons, but Flynn having a girlfriend on the outside was well within the normal. "Long time now. Her name is Phoebe. Phoebe Middlear, I believe." "You've met her?" "A few times. Flynn would sometimes bring her to a bar we were at, but not often." Nadia nodded. This was also common. Distance was a safety measure for Wraiths. It was always best not to give a lover too much hope of any future. "Do you know where she lives?" Nadia got up from her chair, ready to get back to it. Diamira shrugged lightly and shook her head, and Nadia sighed with a smile toward the other woman. "So much for a quick solution, then," she said, knowing she'd need Harmiston's help again. Chapter 6. "I'm telling you," the elderly landlord said while unlocking the door to the apartment Nadia wanted to see. "She's not in here. I haven't seen her in over a week." "Nevertheless," Nadia said, patience and decisiveness radiating from her despite her actual feelings, "I wish to check her home." Of course," the man muttered. "I'm always happy to assist the Wraiths." "Mm-hmm," Nadia uttered, and walked past him and into the tiny apartment. Nadia knew the man was right the second she entered. The place smelled a little shut-in. There was no hint of a scent of a living thing, unless one counted the rat somewhere in the wall to her right. Other than that, a faint layer of dust had begun to settle, and it tickled her nose. "As I said," the landlord murmured behind her, but she ignored him and walked around the tiny space. The bedroom, living room, and kitchen constituted one room altogether with a small bathroom adjacent. That was it. But Phoebe had made it a cozy place with vibrant colors and soft furniture. "Do you know where she might have gone?" Nadia asked the landlord. He hovered by the door, watching her impatiently, trying to hide it from her. His tiptoeing and shuffling told her the truth. He didn't dare stand in the way of a Wraith's business, though. "Can't say that I've spoken much with her." Nadia sifted through some envelopes on the end of the short kitchen counter. "Know an Eluin?" she asked. "They have the same surname, Mittlar." "Eluin Mittlar?" The man shook his head. "Wait, sometimes the rent checks come in that man's name. Her father, maybe?" Nadia nodded. Phoebe was young. Maybe she got a little extra help from a parent still. Either way, it was another clue, so she told the man to find her an address from his paperwork. Since she was a legal adult, all Harmiston who'd searched through the city archives for her could find was Phoebe's information, not anything on someone close to her. It had taken the poor man hours to sort through the information. Nadia thought it best not to tell him it had been in vain since Phoebe hadn't been here in a while. Well, maybe halfway in vain if this new name turned out to be something useful. Half an hour later, Nadia was beginning to think it was more than halfway useful. She was back in the area she'd come across Flynn. That could surely not be a coincidence. She minded to be inconspicuous while walking through the seemingly peaceful neighborhood. Even in the evening's darkness, everything seemed quiet and safe. She could see families through windows, eating dinner together or playing games, reading. It was all so idyllic, isn't it? An all-too-familiar voice sounded behind her. Nadia whirled around, alert for the nearby danger, angry at herself for focusing on another threat than this. "Up here," came the voice again. "Show yourself, Darrow," she said, sword in her hand without a thought to get it there. She glanced up, but before her eyes reached the top of the nearest building, a dark form descended, like a shadow dropping to the ground no more than 4 meters away from her. She doubted anyone in the homes who happened to glance outside would have seen anything. He was too quick and good at hiding. Darrow straightened up what little he needed to and smiled at her. "Your pulse is spiking like you're in danger." "Aren't I?" she asked, not lowering her sword, yet not charging him either. Such a foolish attempt at an open attack wouldn't work on Darrow. "Not from me," he said, and his smile widened. "At the moment." Is that what Nerys thought too before he was fried with that UV bomb? Darrow's eyes narrowed slightly, but his smile remained. "It seems every time I see you these days, you accuse me of one murder or the other." "I am also accusing you of not working alone," she said, eyeing his clothes and general appearance. He wore what looked to be quality clothing, not dressed to impress with riches or to remain hidden in the dark. Of course, his hybrid powers allowed him enough skills to hide from whoever he wanted. Obviously, he didn't have a job to earn a living, so someone was providing for him. He was dressed in grays, pants, shirt, jacket, his dark hair cut short and tidy. He looked like the Darrow she'd known years ago would look when grown. He also looked healthy, more put together, except for the intensity in his eyes, the last visible remnant of his madness. Those eyes were on her and fully alert now. "What do you want, Darrow?" she asked him, not bothering to hide her sigh. She lowered her sword a fraction. She'd come to learn that killing him was difficult for her. She'd had a couple of chances. So had he regarding her, and he'd even saved her life once. The boy she had once loved was long dead, and her heart had grieved him and moved on. Yet, he was still the father of her child regardless of him not knowing that fact, nor would he ever. Nell was a 3/4 werewolf and could theoretically shift form, not Earthside, of course, and Nadia would die before this madman tried bringing her daughter into whatever he was planning here in Agartha. Can't I simply want to catch up with an old friend? No. He clicked his tongue. You've become very harsh over the years. You don't have any friends, Darrow. Tracandis might have some disillusioned and angry followers, but you don't. Darrow slapped a hand to his chest in mock hurt. Oh, the cold and sharp tongues of the Wraiths. You should be more worried about our cold and sharp steel, she said, indicating her sword. Darrow laughed, genuinely and warmly. Now, that was you and not the restrained wraith they've made you into. That was the true you. What do you want, Darrow? She repeated, sounding as exasperated as she felt. He shrugged and stepped closer. Nadia immediately stepped back. This wasn't some standoff where showing no fear and being all strength was necessary. This was a downright monster, and letting him near her was foolish. I suggest a truce, he said then, noting her movement with a deeper frown now. I don't agree. A 10-minute truce, he clarified. Nadia paused. What was this? 10 minutes indicated he wanted some information, not to hold her to a promise of an everlasting truce. Honestly, If I wanted to attack, I wouldn't have let you know I was here before doing it, would I? Nadia considered it. He was superior in so many ways, strength-wise, but even he ought to think a second before attacking a Wraith. Fine, she said, and lowered her sword, though she didn't sheath it. Darrow shrugged and seemed to accept this, because he came closer, hands up in a non-threatening way. At least as non-threatening as a hybrid beast could be, despite looking human in his current form. There's a smell of rot in the air, he said, wrinkling his nose slightly. Is this why you're here? Nadia eyed him with open suspicion, but that was indeed why she was there. Only, she couldn't pick up the scent of Flynn. She sighed. If Darrow wanted a truce, she might as well make use of him. You can smell it? She asked him. Very faint, but there's nothing else in this street other than people's dinners and their pets out in the yards. Darrow made a point of walking past her a few steps and stopping with his back to her. She could attack, of course, but she knew better. He might look unconcerned, but she knew he was on the alert for anything. So was she. Still, she walked after him and simply fell in beside him. It's coming from this direction, he said. At least it's getting less faint. What are you after? A body snatcher or something? That would be better than what I'm after, Nadia said, scanning the nearby area for other Wraiths. The last thing she needed now was one of them accidentally walking past and seeing her fraternizing with the enemy. Smells long dead, Darrow commented, and when they turned a corner, Nadia could smell it too. The weak yet foul smell of rotting flesh. It was faint, but getting stronger. Nadia checked the nearest street sign and saw they had entered the street where Elwyn Middlear's address was listed. Yes, this was it. Darrow stopped abruptly. What are you after, Nad? He asked, looking confused. The smell was stronger for him. Just a case, she said. He didn't need to know everything. A job involving dead bodies? What are you going to do with those? Not like they can be assassinated. Nadia decided not to respond to that comment. Though technically part of a Queen's Guard, she knew the Shadows were seen more like assassins than enforcers of the Queen's law, and people were not that misguided in that notion. Killing their target was, however, not their first course of action. But in Flynn's case? What other choice was there? Besides, he was already dead. The Flynn of the Wraiths was long gone. A peculiar case indeed, Darrow went on, but he didn't move. Instead, he stood still, turning his head like he was looking for something. Nadia, of course, could hear the faint intakes of air as he was trying to identify the smell more closely. Whatever it was passed by here recently, he said. More than one, though. He wrinkled his nose again and then turned to look at Nadia fully. His eyes widened slightly, the madness there joined by surprise. If I didn't know better, I'd say a dead body went through here on its own accord. The scent of humans is older and fainter. No one carried a dead body this way recently. I see your sense of smell wasn't weakened by the vampiric disease inside you, Nadia said to that and continued down the street, this time turning her back to him. He was right. If he wanted to attack, he wouldn't have given her a heads up and then called a truce. She heard his hurried steps, barely audible for humans, but loud enough to pinpoint for her ears, as he caught up and fell in beside her. I'd rather say my senses and strength were heightened, but all people ever talk about are the fractured pieces of my mind. Because that makes you a careless beast? Oh, Nadia, you used to say sweeter things to me than that. That was when there was anything sweet about you. Darrow chuckled and then shook his head. I swear, you go crazy one time, and that's all people ever remember. Wonder why? Nadia muttered, and then eyed the house she was looking for at the same time Darrow made a gagging sound. Is this what I think it is? He asked, and eyed the 4-story structure with sudden interest. It reeks. Are there moving corpses in there? Nadia stopped and stared openly at him. Why are you here, Darrow? She asked again. Your 10 minutes are soon over. Get to the point. What are those things called again? He mused, seemingly ignoring her, but she knew better. Darrow had never ignored her. His brows lowered. Necros, he uttered, and then met her gaze again. I thought those were fairy tales. They're not. Is that what you wanted to know? Darrow smiled then, his usual manic smile. Oddly enough, yes. Nadia frowned, not caring that she was showing emotions. You're here to find out what I'm working on? Can't I be concerned for your welfare? Like when you threw a silver grenade at me? She threw back in a dry voice. Ha! Says she who did the same to me. Nadia shook her head and then made a rolling motion with her free hand to get a move on. Why the sudden interest in my work? I'm not sure your work is what interests me most, Nad. Darrow took in the quiet street around them, the smile still on his lips. No one came out or passed them by. The rumble of a car one street over was the only nearby noise. You kept secrets from me, at least one. Something made you turn on me. You keep saying that. And yet tonight, I don't believe that's what made you follow me here. She stopped herself and canted her head, studying him. He'd called his little truce, but hadn't asked or pried much, merely taken an interest in her tracking, and her newest case. And that was without knowing what it was. She was sure of that, because of the surprise in him at finding out a necros was a real thing. That was when it dawned on her. You want to know if I'm tasked with hunting you, don't you? She asked, despite knowing the answer already. Maybe I like knowing my enemies, Darrow said. He sounded like it didn't matter, but of course it did. Why else would he do this? Oh, we are enemies, Darrow. Your very nature makes you a beast to hunt and stop. My nature? Not my alleged crimes? Nadia smiled then. In your case, they're the same thing. Maybe so, he shrugged, but I would have thought they'd put you on that team. That showed he didn't know everything about the Wraiths. There were no teams among the shadows. They worked alone and used shields when necessary. Atherton was on the case with all the responsibilities that entailed. Unless, Darrow went on, oblivious to her silent conclusions, you have downplayed our past. He smiled again and playfully tisked at her. Oh, Nadia, I never thought I'd see the day where you would be ashamed of me. Not ashamed. Never that. Just protective of her daughter and every trace of him that could lead someone to her. I have nothing to be ashamed of, she said, and meant it, subconsciously not thinking about all her lies. But believe me when I say I will get on that team if you give me a reason to. Would it help if I said I did not kill Nerys? What would it matter? She asked earnestly. He shrugged again, and a flicker of sadness crossed his beautiful face, the enhanced beauty of a vampire. It wouldn't, I suppose. Life is what it turned out to be without our say-so. He broke eye contact with her then, and looked down the street to the house where Elwyn lived. He didn't know that, of course, but he could smell the activity within even from where they were standing, half a block away. A necros, then? He commented, drawing the conversation away from their painful past and present. Well, he corrected himself, more than one. How interesting. Mindless soldiers. Yes, interesting. He gave a lopsided grin, looking like he was seeing something for the first time. Well, he repeated in a tone that suggested the conversation and the truce was over. Have fun with that. Nadia only had time to raise her sword, but he backed up and leaped over a fence and into the nearest front yard. He jumped up on the wall of the building there and climbed up at a speed only those who could defy gravity could manage, leaving Nadia behind, confused and slightly worried. Chapter 7. The 4-story home of Elwyn Middlear was well kept and no different from any other building on the same street. Dusk was falling by the time Nadia sneaked inside, though. For her, the house screamed trouble with the foul smell of rotting flesh emanating from it. Nadia couldn't make sense of it either. The smell was strong, but likely not to any of the neighbors. If any of them sensed anything, they probably thought it an issue with the sewers and left it at that. But Nadia's nose was too attuned to the various scents around her at all times. Some, one learned to tune out, like car exhaust and urine in the streets. But this was too strange to ignore. She thought Darrow was right. There was more than one source of the odious smell coming from the house. 2 of them, she thought, though what the difference was, she couldn't say. The house seemed quiet. She cased the place, noting everything going on, or not, on all sides, including the neighbors. But it was getting late, and these were working people in the middle of the week. Most were home and inside, and those who weren't were likely at the closest bar. Nadia selected a window on the ground floor to enter. She had considered simply ringing the doorbell, but if she came inside via an invitation, they sure weren't going to show her the source of the smell voluntarily. This way, she could hopefully discover the whole truth on her own. The window had been closed and locked, but not with something substantial enough to stop one of the Queen's Wraiths. Nadia tucked the handy little thin blade used to open simple locks back in a pocket in her coat as she took in the room. As expected, she'd entered a small den that was not occupied by anyone at the moment. She'd deduced from outside that though there were lights on in a few rooms in the house, few people were moving about, if any. She had a distinct feeling there were no full-time servants in this household. If there had been, they sure would have noticed the smell. It was worse inside. To any regular person, it probably smelled like a few rodents had died in one of the walls. Nadia walked across the room, past comfortable and old-looking furniture, toward the door. She paused, but could hear no one moving around nearby. Still, she reached for the necklace around her neck, pulling the unusual pendant out from behind her shirt. The amulet she'd taken off a werewolf who'd tried his best to kill her shone with its turquoise light, the tiny anemoy newt within sleeping soundly. Harmiston had fixed the broken amulet for her and figured out how to activate it too. Nadia took it in one hand and held it safely in her palm, waking the little magical creature up. She felt the metal and glass heat up in her hand and opened it, peering at the little fellow. He was awake now, moving around in his little space. His movements activated the charm embedded in the amulet, effectively leaving Nadia soundless. She tucked it back behind her shirt to avoid the turquoise light revealing her whereabouts and carefully opened the door. This allowed her to walk without a sound now, but her voice was not silenced, nor were things she handled and threw away. Only her body, not her mind and voice, was affected by the charm. And it worked. She'd never used it on a job before, merely practiced a little in her room at the Cube, but as she walked into the hallway outside the den, even her ears couldn't pick up the sound from her already light steps. She could clap her hands together and no one would know unless they saw her do it. Satisfied, she moved on through the house. This was only one household. There were no signs of the building being separated into smaller apartments, which was usual throughout the city. That meant Elwyn was well-to-do. Since she hadn't known about him when Harmiston had researched his daughter, Nadia could only guess where his money came from. It could all be because of an inheritance. Not that it mattered much to her. What she wanted to know was why the reek of the dead seemed to emanate from below. She eased her way through several hallways and corridors, only crossing through a few rooms where necessary. Nadia located the stairs to the basement behind the kitchen, the door in question next to the pantry. She noticed the foyer to her left, right down from the basement door, which was hidden from any guest's view. There, she listened for any sounds of people nearby, but heard nothing from the floor she was on. She knew the way to go was down. Even if there hadn't been a smell of death in the house, there was a low buzzing sound coming from down there. Whatever had happened to Flynn, Nadia was sure this was the place to look. She was also pretty sure that Elwyn was the necromancer behind Flynn's return to the world of the living. Too bad Flynn hadn't been returned as a full-fledged member of that group. When the door opened, the sound from below became easier to identify, and she realized it was that of chanting. Low and monotonous, a slow rhythm reaching up to Nadia. The sound made her skin crawl. Despite that, she went down, keeping quiet out of old habit despite the amulet around her neck doing the job for her. The stairs led down to a storage room, the floor and walls made of concrete. It was cold and dank, but the various crates and bottles looked clean and in order, stacked against the walls. The basement seemed the same size as the house above, large and with lots of equipment instead of furniture. Nadia followed the sound of the chanting and the smell, which was becoming stronger by the second. Down there, the smell was suffocating. Wraiths were used to and had dealt with death many times before reaching the rank of shield, so the smell of it was something they knew how to handle. Now, it was overwhelming to the point of making Nadia gag. She had to utilize the trick they all used in the shade and push her conscious reactions to the rank scent to the back of her mind. She still thought of it as two different smells, though. One was reminiscent of what she'd come across countless times near dead bodies. The other seemed more refined, more pungent in a clear way. Strange as that sounded to her. It was almost chemical. She pressed on and came upon the chanters in one of the innermost rooms from the stairs. The smell of damp dirt mixed into the overwhelming smell of rot, and when she reached the doorway leading in there, she could see why. Careful not to be noticed, she peered inside, hiding behind the doorframe, and her theory of a necromancer was both confirmed and squashed at the same time. The sight that met her was that of several necromancers, 4 judging by the number of humans without rotting flesh in there, 3 men and 1 woman. They stood, surrounding a meter-high mound of dirt, 4 figures close by them, standing there, motionless, apathetic, dead, and in different states of decomposition. Their clothes were filthy and tattered, affected by the body's differing states. Nadia quickly identified Flynn among them, the newest member of this departed group judging by appearance. Nadia took a breath, open-mouthed, in remembrance of her lost comrade, and then focused on the scene in front of her. That thing was not Flynn any more than the 3 other Necros were, whoever they had once been. The dead body of a young woman placed on the low mound in the center of the room was most definitely not a Necros, though the necromancers were working on it. Nadia had no magical abilities herself, but she could feel the cold magic that flowed through that room while the necromancers chanted and drew their powers together, working on reawakening the poor wretch between them. Judging by the twitches in the body's hands and feet, they were well on their way to succeeding. The chanting suddenly dropped in volume and Nadia tensed, but no, she had not been discovered. Only 1 necromancer kept the chant going, uttering the same strange words over and over. He was the oldest of the men with gray hair and beard, a few kilos extra, and what could likely be a friendly face, except now it was focused to the point of looking void of empathy, at least to Nadia. How could he and the other 3 be doing this? It was cruel, disrespectful, and careless. She assumed this man to be Phoebe's father. The other 2 were younger, in their late 20s, hardly candidates for being her parent. The woman looked to be Elwyn's age. Nadia assumed this quartet kept together because of their shared abilities rather than any shared generational reason. Elwyn went on with his chant, the volume lowered to where Nadia could have been heard had she made a sound, but the amulet kept her hidden in that respect. A cold and stinging energy blew out from the group in there. Nadia shuddered at the sensation and noted that the necromancers did not. The looks of excitement on their faces rather said the opposite. This was clean and beautiful to them. Nadia stared with disapproval. Then she pushed that opinion to the back of her mind, right along with the discomfort of the smell, and thought about what to do. Running in there with her sword drawn wouldn't get her far. She knew little of the Necros' strength and agility, since she'd never encountered them before nor met anyone who had. But there were 4, soon to be 5 of them, judging by how the dead woman was now sitting up. It gave Nadia goosebumps to witness, yet she assumed that to be more of a reaction to the vile magic she could sense than anything else. She'd been through worse than this, but 5 Necros and 4 necromancers were likely too much for one Wraith, at least if she was forced to take them on. And if she were to do it alone, she would never choose this dank place with only one exit. What if they blocked her escape route? No, she needed to wait, and... Something clinked, like metal hitting metal, a spoon in a sink. Nadia turned her head, though she did not let the necromancers out of her sight. That noise had come from upstairs. Someone was indeed up there, then. Maybe they had just come in. No, she would surely have heard the front door if she could hear sounds coming from the kitchen. She frowned. The necromancers, if they had heard it, didn't let it bother them. Someone they knew, then? Not ready to reveal herself, Nadia backed up and turned for the exit. She headed back toward the stairs. The necromancers were likely going to be at it a while longer. The new necro seemed stiff and hard to control at this point. Nadia forced her focus away from the solo chant and up the stairs. Yes, she could most certainly hear footsteps up there. Testing the amulet a little, she walked up normally, and her steps never sounded. Whoever was up there didn't react either, though they were close to the door. Nadia reached it, drew her dagger, and then opened it with care. Swinging a sword in the hallway was not her best bet. The dagger was a better choice in narrow spaces. She stepped out and saw a young woman heading for the main stairs leading upstairs. She wore a dark blue dress that reached below her knees and block-heeled shoes that were more sensible than elegant, yet a little bit of both. Her long, light brown hair was gathered in a ponytail at her neck, and she carried a small bowl which smelled of some sort of milky substance. Nadia couldn't quite identify it. She could identify the woman, though, based on the descriptions from Flynn's closest friends among the Wraiths. "Phoebe?" she said, and minded to keep her voice low enough not to attract the attention of the group in the basement. Phoebe turned, and her eyes immediately widened in shock at the sight of Nadia, her mouth quivering as she dropped the bowl. It hit the floor and broke apart, a white sludge spraying from it. "My name is Nadia and—" "Wraith!" Phoebe screamed, her loud voice shattering the quiet of the house, and then bolted up the stairs. Nadia blinked and then bounded after the woman, jumping over the mess on the floor. Her boots hit the steps with force as she ran up, eyes glued to Phoebe, who ran with an impressive speed for a civilian. What reaction was this anyway? Phoebe had been involved with a Wraith. Why so scared of them? Nadia turned right on the landing in the attic, 3 floors above. No wonder she hadn't heard Phoebe if she'd been all the way up there being quiet. She followed the flurry that was Phoebe down a narrow corridor. There were several doors on each side, but the frightened woman ran to one at the end which stood ajar. She slammed it open so hard when she entered, it was already banging shut again when Nadia reached it. A high-pitched scream pierced through the room, just when Nadia forced the door back open. It slammed into the wall again with a crack. Nadia stopped short, ready to attack in case Phoebe should try something, yet frozen on the spot at the sight of her now. Nadia was vaguely aware of sounds coming from below, but the moving bundle in the other woman's arms stole all her focus. It was an infant, and it screamed, frightened by the sudden sharp noises. Its mother's fear likely did nothing to calm it down. Phoebe backed up into the farthest corner of the bedroom and placed herself so she halfway stood with the child against the wall, putting her body between it and Nadia while looking at her over her shoulder with desperate fear in her eyes. Please don't kill him, she shouted, her voice shaking. Nadia glanced around. There was a crib placed next to a bed, and baby clothes and clean diapers on a desk and dresser, some of it peeking out of the drawers. She could spot Phoebe's clothing as well. All this went through Nadia's mind as she realized the woman had to be living here despite renting an apartment in a different part of the city. The lack of properly settling in spoke of haste. And then there were the photos placed on the desk behind everything else stacked on it, yet still visible. Photos of Phoebe and the baby. They couldn't be more than a few weeks old, judging by the size of the child. But it was the framed photo of Phoebe, the baby, and Flynn which said it all. Phoebe was leaning against him, both of them gazing at the infant with love in their eyes. Flynn even wore a white shirt. It looked almost surreal to Nadia, but it confirmed what she had realized the moment she laid eyes on the baby. This was the child of a Wraith, a forbidden child. And here stood another Wraith with a dagger in hand. No wonder Phoebe was scared out of her wits. She looked like a frightened animal, trapped and with no way out. Nadia sheathed her dagger and raised her hands to say something calming, but more noises from downstairs caught her attention. The necromancers. Cursing herself silently, she turned on her heel and ran back out and toward the stairs. Phoebe's reaction to a Wraith nearby had been so suspicious, Nadia had chased her instead of locking the necromancers inside the basement. She jumped several steps at the time to get down to the ground floor fast enough. The sound of a door slamming urged her on to where she nearly lost her balance at a hard landing. Her right leg ached at the impact, yet she pushed on, the dagger back in her hand. She reached the floor, and the first thing she saw was the door to the basement wide open. Then she spotted the front door. It was closed, but she had heard a door bang shut too. A knot turned in her stomach, and she went to open it. No one was outside. There was nothing but the lovely front yard and the quiet street beyond. Nadia controlled her breathing, which she couldn't hear anyway, and focused her senses on the house. That was when she noticed she couldn't smell the foul stench of rot anymore. She couldn't smell the natural kind, nor the more refined one. It was all gone, no remnant even. Bland asphodel. She shook her head. They'd used the dried flower to mask their scent. Clever. And annoying. She couldn't trace them unless they left breadcrumbs for her. She glanced down at the porcelain shards and the white mess on the floor. Baby food, of course. All Nadia had now was a frightened mother and her infant son. Nadia turned and ran back upstairs. Phoebe was Eloin's daughter. She might know where he'd go. Nadia only needed to persuade the woman that she was a friend, not someone sent to kill her child. For all their strict rules about not having children, the Wraiths did not do that. But as she ran down the corridor for the second time, her ears confirmed even more bad news before she pushed open the door to the bedroom again. Nadia stopped short inside a room void of any people. She glanced around and then tried listening. There were no sounds. The baby had been crying, and she doubted he could have been silenced that easily. If she wasn't hearing it crying, or the mother running, it meant they had also left the house. She noticed an open door out in the corridor and saw the top of some narrow stairs there. Back stairs. Nadia shook her head. She would bet money on them leading down and out a back way. This was a large house, after all. Nadia pursed her lips in anger at herself. She had botched this, hadn't she? The only trace remaining of the people in the house was now a faint smell of rot in the bedroom, as well as the sweet and pure scent of the baby. What manner of horror had it been born into? Chapter 8. Life in the cube went on like normal. Wraiths came and went, going to and from their work and duties, others being sociable in their scant, spare time. There weren't many smiles about, but there was an air of contentment that raced through the building. Nadia felt none of it when she returned after her unfortunate case. She'd spent over an hour trying to pick up any trace the necromancers might have left behind, but there had been nothing. No smell. No one who'd seen anything, and especially no tracks on cobbled streets. It was frustrating, but Nadia kept it bottled up as she passed her friends and fellow Wraiths. Complaining was not in their vocabulary, and this was her case, not theirs. She needed to figure it out. She would figure it out. "Nadia!" a familiar voice shouted through the large common areas. She turned left to see Victoria waving at her, breaking off from a small group of shield wraiths their age. Victoria, with her chestnut-colored hair which was perfectly coiffed, was wearing a flowery blouse and the fashionable pant skirts of the court. She hurried over with quick steps. If Nadia wasn't mistaken, there was a distinct bounce in them. The smile on her friend's face suggested Nadia wasn't mistaken at all. "What's got you so glum?" Victoria asked Nadia when she reached her. "Who says I'm glum? This is my normal face." Victoria chuckled. "You forget I grew up with all of you." She waved a hand casually, indicating the black-clad figures all around her. "I know how to read your sullen yet lovable faces." "You seem more on the lovable side today," Nadia said, to draw attention away from her own foolish failure. Victoria seemed unusually chirpy. "Something happen?" "Yes." Her friend's smile grew even wider as she pulled at a necklace around her neck. "Armin proposed to me." Nadia eyed the pendant, which she hadn't seen before. But to be fair, Victoria was a fashionable lady of the Queen's court. She wore a lot of jewelry, and Nadia couldn't keep up. Despite being such close friends, they moved in very different worlds. The pendant, though, was a lapis lazuli embedded into a bed of white gold roses, no more than 2 centimeters wide. It was a beautiful thing, no doubt created by a talented goldsmith. It was also a token of an engagement. "Since you're wearing that, I take it you said yes?" Nadia asked, holding her breath. She could never keep up with the strict social rules of the court either. She knew Victoria was under a lot of pressure to conform to those norms, especially out of allegiance to her deceased parents. She'd even considered proposals that would lead her into powerful, yet more businesslike marriage alliances, and that had always made Nadia wary, even though she lived a strictly regulated life herself. "I did," Victoria said, practically beaming. "Then I am glad." Nadia gave a quick and contented smile. She truly meant that. "Elisatra seems a loyal sort to me. I like him." "Of course you do if you see him that way. Every Wraith would." Victoria gave a conspiratorial wink. She couldn't very well bring up Elisatra's son, Varric, out loud. The vampiric daywalker's son Nadia had helped them hide from the Queen's law by bringing him earthside instead of killing him. "Maybe," Nadia conceded. "But what pleases me most is that you both care for each other. I've always wished for that kind of happiness for you." "Oh no, now you've set off the waterworks, Nad," Victoria said, waving her hands in front of her face to stave it off. "Sorry, you know how cruel Wraiths can be," she quipped. "Cruel?" Harmiston's voice floated toward them before he came up to them. "What did you say to make her cry?" he added with a quizzical look in Victoria's direction. "She's using the only weapon that works against me," Victoria said, wiping a tear from her eye. "Kindness." Harmiston turned his blues toward Nadia, raising an eyebrow. Nadia shrugged. "We are trained to strike where it hurts the most," she told him, completely deadpan. Harmiston glanced between them. "A most peculiar friendship, this," he muttered. He looked like he was coming into work, a satchel stuffed with books hanging from his shoulder. Nadia wondered how much sleep he'd bothered to get. Chroniclers were known to live for work, and often to live more at work than at home. "I need a word with you," she added to him. "I will let you have that word in peace," Victoria said, having composed herself now. "I'm too happy to listen to whatever beast needs beheading today." Still, getting a word with Harmiston meant waiting until he could also be told the joyous news. Since he was also of a more chatty disposition than Nadia, It was 20 minutes later when she finally followed him into his lab, explaining the happenings in Elwyn's house, though downplaying her handling of the necromancers and Phoebe at the end there. 4 necromancers? He repeated, and seemed to veer off into his own mind. After about 10 seconds of this, he snapped out of it and hurried over to the stack of books on the subject. Nadia noticed it had grown since last time with a few more dusty tomes. "A group of them," Harmiston said while sifting through the pages of one of the books. "That's extraordinary. First we have none, and now there's many. Extraordinary," he chattered on, though to her or himself, she wasn't sure. "They've been doing a great job of keeping hidden." He looked up and right at Nadia. "And the only reason they've been discovered is because Flynn was seeing the daughter of one of the necromancers?" "Yes." "I wonder if he knew." "Doubtful." "It sure was a mistake reawakening him." Harmiston focused on the book again, turning a few pages. "Here it is. Well, sort of. Not like something so forbidden should be explained in detail unless it is in one of the necromancer's books, is it?" "What is?" Nadia asked and walked over to have a look. Harmiston's ramblings weren't always that clear to anyone but him. There was so much information being processed in that head of his. She peered over at the pages and wondered how the chronicler could read the small and squiggly scribbles written there. "The creation of a necros," Harmiston explained, eyes glued to the page. "It takes a lot of a necromancer to do so. It's a long-lasting ritual, and in a sense, the necromancer has to connect his soul to the dead for it to even rise." Nadia grimaced. "Disturbing." "I agree." Harmiston traced the scrawled writing with his finger without looking up. "And you said there were 4 necromancers and 5 necros?" "Yes. One of the necromancers is exceptionally strong then. It says here it takes knowledge and great power to control more than one at a time. The text speaks of a few extraordinary exceptions, of course, but what are the odds we have both a group of them and an extraordinarily strong necromancer? That is unlikely. Maybe Elwyn is a bit more experienced than the others." He had been the one to awaken the female necros, after all. Maybe he was strong enough at this point in life to control 2 of them at the same time? "And the body was placed on a mound of dirt?" Harmiston went on. Nadia confirmed it. "Both the necros and the necromancers are connected to the earth, and no wonder. That is where most dead are placed. Maybe not so much here in Agartha, where cremation is most common. But it also says here that they are drawn to, or fare better, near soil and moist and dank places. If Flynn did indeed have a child, which is incredibly uncommon, I mean, he was a wraith." "He did have one," Nadia broke in, wishing to end this line of thinking. She'd told Harmiston and asked him not to record it in the archives to preserve Flynn's legacy within the Wraiths. "A boy," she clarified. Phoebe had referred to the child as him, after all. "Yes, well, I don't think Flynn. I mean, Flynn the Necros hangs around Phoebe and the child for sentimental reasons. No, his body walks, but it truly is a mindless thing. At least I hope so for his sake." Harmiston visibly shuddered. "But anyway, if there was any sentimentality in him, you'd think he would come here." "Here? The cube?" "It was his home for most of his life." "Yes." Nadia nodded thoughtfully. "So you're saying where the necromancer is where I'll find him then?" Harmiston was lost in the book again, but he looked up and met her gaze then. Those eyes were such a lovely shade of blue. It took Nadia a second to realize how close they were standing, staring at each other, both of them at a loss of words. Close enough for her to notice the green-colored flecks in his eyes. Harmiston dropped his gaze, and she automatically did the same, taking in his lips, slightly parted, the sound of his almost inaudible intake of breath reaching her ears. He was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. Or was it she that was so close? She'd moved, hadn't she? Harmiston uttered, and she raised her gaze, seeing the look in his eyes, still caught on her and now mixed with confusion and hope. Nadia cleared her throat and took a step back. What was she doing? Harmiston looked uncomfortable, clearing his own throat and blinking before trying to focus on the book again. He still stood with his index finger placed at the word he'd stopped at. What did you ask?" he said, clearing his voice again. Nadia took another step back. Distance was her safest bet here. She'd already trusted this man with a lot concerning Victoria and her new fiancé, but there was too much hidden in Nadia's life to even think about getting involved with anyone inside the cube, especially inside the cube. "Will I find Flynn near his necromancer master?" she asked again, amazed at how level her voice sounded. Years of training with the Wraiths had made her skilled at hiding her emotions. Except she'd just been too close to Harmiston, and she couldn't truly stop thinking about him. "Yes." Harmiston nodded and pointedly stared down at the book. Did he look... Nadia narrowed her eyes, not that she needed to see better at a distance of 2 meters. His skin was reddening slightly. For some reason, that sight almost made her smile before she quashed that too. I don't think he was in that building only because his girlfriend and their child were there. The question is really why her father decided to bring him back. Revenge, maybe? Harmiston looked up and at nothing, his brain back in the game now. It wasn't like Flynn was going to raise the child, was it? No, Nadia said, glad Harmiston wasn't looking at her then. He couldn't. That doesn't mean he didn't care, though, she added, thinking about the photo she'd seen. Flynn had looked so happy, the corners of his eyes crinkling from the genuine smile on his face. No, of course not, Harmiston hastened to add. But the child's grandfather might not have seen it that way. Nadia nodded thoughtfully. Maybe. You look like you have another idea, Harmiston pointed out, absorbed enough in the case again to look at her. I have no idea. There's just something strange about this. Really? Stranger than a necro stepping out of myth and into our lives? Harmiston lowered his brows. It takes a lot to unsettle you Wraiths, huh? Nadia shrugged slightly and looked to the door. She needed some food and rest before heading back out again. Besides, she doubted the necromancers would return to the house at first light. They'd been spooked thoroughly by her presence, judging by their hasty escape. Hey, she added to Harmiston before leaving, noting how she felt hesitant to even do that. Still, years of duty and discipline compelled her to. So would the secret she guarded. Staying near Harmiston was proving to become risky. She should treat him as a friend and nothing more. But friends deserved a thank you when earned. She reached for the chain around her neck and pulled the amulet free from behind her shirt. This works wonders, she told him. Thank you for repairing it for me. Harmiston lit up and flashed her a dazzling smile then. Of course, he said. Anything to help you, Nad. She couldn't help reciprocate that smile, tight-lipped, but still. Nor did she doubt he truly meant that. Chapter 9. Frustration coursed through Nadia at the realization that Eluin had indeed left his house and abandoned it. She'd broken in again the night following her failed attempt at stopping the necromancers. Well, broken in was a stretch since the door had been unlocked from the previous night. She was there without an invitation, though, but the police never questioned such things of the Wraiths should a curious neighbor call them. Nadia moved quietly through all floors of the house but found no one and nothing to hint at where they could have gone. Since she had no way of knowing the names of Eluin's co-conspirators, she couldn't check their addresses either. Eluin's house was turning into a dead end, and unfortunately, she was to blame for it. If only she'd blocked the basement door before running after Phoebe. This was a lack of judgment the Wraiths prided themselves in never having. She'd been foolish and rash. Nadia bristled as she stared down at the untidy collection of baby clothes in Phoebe's room at the top of the house. Nadia knew she needed to set things right and stop this, both for her own pride and for the sake of Flynn. Her pride was inconsequential in all regards. That was what Wraiths were trained to think. But in training them that way, their pride was molded into the way they lived their lives, bound in duty and honor. If someone wanted to hurt a Wraith where it mattered, making them fail at the standards of the Wraiths was the best place to start. Still, Nadia couldn't sulk for long. She didn't truly know how to sulk either. Flynn was her priority. So was the reputation of the Wraiths, and a dead Wraith walking around and causing havoc was not good for their collective standing in the city. She realized she was staring at a bright green onesie. The child was a consideration she hadn't factored in. Flynn had gone and done what he was not supposed to do. He'd gotten tied to something outside the Wraiths, something important enough to cause a rift in his loyalties. Nadia doubted the child had been planned. At least not from Flynn's side. She turned and took in the image of the two parents with their baby. He obviously cared for both his girlfriend and their child, though, planned or not. But this could have cost him his place among the Wraiths, and like every one of them, he'd been raised and trained as a Wraith since the age of 12. He hadn't left the Queen's Guard of his own free will, either. Nadia wondered if he ever would have. It was likely that Phoebe would have ended up as his dark secret for the rest of her life. Or even more likely, that their relationship wouldn't have lasted with all the hiding and skulking about to protect Flynn from dishonor. Maybe he'd had a plan? Maybe, like Nadia, he had aspired to become a ghost instead, to be allowed to have a family. But the ghosts did not allow just anyone to join them. Much like Victoria's life at court was ruled by a strict who's who, so were the ghosts. Nadia sighed and tore her gaze from the photo and the idyllic scene on it. She'd never know now. She, more than anyone, could understand Flynn's plight. She couldn't help feeling sympathetic. That sympathy was not to be mistaken for stupidity, though. When she heard a clay pot falling and hitting the ground, shattering, she moved to the window and stared down at the front yard. Despite the darkness, she recognized Flynn, or his body that was, as he ambled up the front steps toward the front door, toppling over another potted plant on his way. There was no agility or grace in his movements anymore. This body was walking due to sheer magical will. Nadia frowned. Her sympathies were not for that thing. Flynn was gone, and Elwyn had desecrated his body, forcing it to remain among the living, a threat to them all. Nadia drew her sword this time despite being inside. She would need it to kill this beast properly. The Necros made no effort to keep particularly quiet. It walked inside and she could hear it both stomping and dragging its feet. Stairs had to be a challenge, but up it came, while Nadia walked with more care down to meet it. One good swing with her sword, and this would be over and done with. Destroy the head or burn the thing. That was what she'd learned as a girl. With few documented experiences to rely on, this information was all she had to go by. But it made sense to her. Most beings, whether living or undead, could not function without a head. It was usually a safe bet. The stench was back, the bland asphodel no longer working. The rot reeked up the stairs, foretelling the Necros' approach. No one needed the heightened senses of a half-werewolf to smell this. Nadia had descended to the first floor when the Necros reached it. For a moment she stopped and looked it in the eyes, but there was no recollection there. Not even of her clothes. Flynn would have stopped and acknowledged her. The Necros did not. Its eyes were matte and staring blindly ahead. Nadia felt a pang of sadness at the sight of the worn and already tattered clothing on it. A shirt, pants, and proper boots for moving around the city and the shade. He still wore most of his Wraith attire, minus the weapons and coat, though everything was more gray from filth and dust than anything now. The Necros kept walking with stilted steps toward her, and when it became aware of her blocking its way, its fumbling and slow movements changed altogether. Nadia ducked the initial blow as the decomposing arm came right at her face. She twisted sideways and sent a kick straight for the Necros' abdomen. The force of it sent it staggering backward, and Nadia followed, taking advantage of the space between them now. She swung her sword high and with all her strength, ready to sever the Necros' head from its body. Her blade struck bone, but not the one she'd hoped. The neck bone was safe as she yanked to free her sword from the Necros' forearm. It had parried with the appendage so fast it amazed Nadia, and it wasn't inhibited by pain like anyone else either. Gurgles and hisses escaped it, the only sounds it could make, and it lunged toward Nadia with an uncanny speed and strength. She refused to let go of her sword and barely escaped the cold fist headed her way by jumping and kicking off from the wall to her left. The motion helped her yank the blade loose. The Necros fully focused on her now, hissed and kicked at her, hitting her right foot when she landed, more by chance than anything. It disturbed her balance, and she fell on her side, grunting in pain as she landed awkwardly. The Necros did not hesitate, but stomped forward and raised both hands, fists clenched. Nadia glanced up, reacted, and rolled to the side. The Necros slammed its fist on the step mere centimeters from where Nadia's body had been. She hurried to get up on her feet, turning so she had the beast in her sight. It came at her again, relentless in its attack, fists swinging, hard and unforgiving. Nadia ducked and dodged, moving so she could gain a more favorable position. She didn't have the space needed to land a blow like she needed to finish off the Necros. The hallway and landing were too narrow and cluttered with things. Her only choice was getting higher on the stairs and the open space there. She quickly ducked under the Necros' arm, placing herself between it and the stairs, a precarious place to be. Quick as a snake, she popped up and socked the thing in its slack, motionless face with the pommel of her sword. She needed space between them. Her punch sent the Necros a few paces back, but there was no reaction in its face. Its mouth was parted, the skin waxy, the eyes as dead as before it started attacking. Nadia raised her sword, ready to cleave its head off. Finally, she had enough space to do so. "Nadia!" someone shouted, worry in their voice. Nadia hesitated a second. Darrow? That was his voice from outside. She was sure of it. A deathly hard fist hit her abdomen and her breath was knocked out of her. Nadia flew back and felt nothing beneath her feet. She smacked into the wall opposite and fell on the stairs, unable to stifle a cry of pain completely. The sword dropped from her hand, but her eyes were on the dark figure looming above, the gurgled sounds from its throat, the smell of death clinging to it. It stumbled up the stairs toward her. Nadia crawled a few steps backward, feeling for her sword and finding it. She got up, ignoring the pain her body protested with. She glanced at the banister and judged the Necros' clumsy ascent. Stairs really weren't its friend. Nadia kicked sideways and hit the Necros again, hardly injuring it, but unsettling its motions enough for her to win a few precious seconds. She jumped up on the banister and swung her sword haphazardly against the Necros. The thing ducked and made no sound when the blade sliced at its shoulder, tearing the shirt there, drawing no blood from the cold and waxy tissue. Nadia barely noticed this as she leaped, landing above the Necros on the stairs, keeping the higher ground. She whirled around and kicked again before the Necros could react. Her foot landed square between its shoulder blades, and the brutal impact sent the creature sprawling forward. There came no scream, only the hissing noise as the Necros fell, the body hitting the hard angles of the steps and the wall. It tumbled down and Nadia could hear bones breaking, ribs most likely, when she hurried to run after it. With her sword at the ready, she quickly judged the angle needed for the deed and raised it, ready to strike as she stopped 3 steps above. With the added height aiding her with gravity, she could end this swift and— "Nadia!" Darrow shouted again, barging in through the open front door. This time, she didn't hesitate. Ignoring him, barely seeing him there, she struck. Something flashed before her eyes, white and silvery. Her eyes burned, and she reared back, reacting on instinct. Everything before her blurred. She saw Darrow force a bag over the Necros' head, Another figure, a blonde woman, behind him with her hands full of ropes. After that, everything darkened and she struggled to stay awake. She fumbled backward, up against the first turn in the stairs, pushing back against the corner there. She couldn't see. And there was both a necros and a were-vamp hybrid below her besides an unknown figure. Wraiths had been trained for this from an early age. Forcing the panic back, she sharpened her other senses. The woman with Darrow had the unmistakable scent of herbs. She could hear the muffled gargles of the necros under the hood, the rustle of ropes being wound around it. Nadia stayed her breathing. She needed her hearing. If Darrow attacked now, she would be lucky to hear anything. Clenching her hand around the hilt of her sword, she found her silver dagger and drew it. She raised it and held it defensively in front of her throat, ready to strike him or cut her own throat before he could bite her, if need be. Her breathing came ragged then, adrenaline coursing through her, but the scuffle below didn't end. She could decidedly hear 3 sets of feet hitting the floor. Then, Darrow's cold voice again. "Door!" The order aimed at the woman with him. She heard them maneuver the fighting necros toward it, and then out through it, both of them cursing at the struggling creature they had captured. The world blurred in front of her again then, something coming into shape. Her eyesight was returning. "Here, remember this," she heard Darrow whisper to the woman. Then came the recognizable sound of hands rubbing together. One of them was crushing bland asphodel out there to mask their scent and not leave a trail. "No!" Nadia gasped and forced herself to her feet. Her sight was blurry as she staggered down the last few steps and over to the door. But like Darrow had planned it, by the time she came outside, her eyes good enough to track them, they were gone. There was no scent to trace, only the distant sound of an engine starting and a car driving off, too far away for her to catch up. Nadia exhaled and sank down on the front steps, ignoring the couple taking a stroll outside in the street who halted and stared openly at her before hurrying away to mind their own business. She blinked hard and found her eyesight to be back to normal. But what had just happened? Nadia truly wasn't one for soliloquies, but she allowed a short and to-the-point one anyway. "What in the realms, Darrow?" Chapter 10. Nadia, a word. Nadia resisted the urge to close her eyes and sigh heavily. She was surrounded by wraiths in every direction. Such undisciplined behavior simply wouldn't do. She stopped her descent down the main stairs inside the cube and turned, greeting Spectre Terrace with a polite nod. The half-elf reached her quickly, giving the impression of gliding down the steps more than walking. He might be a half-breed, but Terrace had certainly inherited the grace of his elven forebears. "What can I do for you, Spectre?" she asked when he stopped beside her. His cool eyes considered her, as non-revealing as always. Then he gave a slight nod sideways, indicating they should walk. Nadia acquiesced and followed his lead. "An update on your case? I have seen nothing registered in the files." "Not much to report yet," she said, hoping to avoid revealing her own mistakes here. Tricandis was the biggest and most hazardous case the Wraiths had these days, but a necros roaming the city came in at a close second. Then there was the added strain of the necros being one of their own. Nadia was sick of lies, though. Keeping them straight got tiring sometimes. "I believe there is more than one necromancer in the city," she offered. She needed more time. "More than one? Agartha hasn't seen any for centuries." Nadia creased her eyebrows. "You are knowledgeable about this, Spectre." Terrace waved that off. "I talked to Chronicler. He was oddly educated on the subject, but I assume you've been using him for this already." "Correct." Nadia felt a strange sensation in the pit of her stomach at the fact that someone else was using Harmiston's services as the Cube Chronicler. It was ridiculous. Harmiston was here to help anyone who needed it. She knew many of the Wraiths went to him. It wasn't like she had dibs on the man in any way. She gave a mental sigh. She was being ridiculous, even thinking about this. Time to stop analyzing her reactions to the man and simply ignore them. It wasn't lost on her that this was becoming easier said than done. "Tell me about these necromancers." "Not much to say. I saw them with the one known necromancer. According to what Chronicler found out, there are probably more than one necros too." She would not admit defeat on this one and be taken off the case. She just needed some way to track them, and then, when she located them, she would not let them out of her sight. Terrace mulled this over and stopped. They had reached the front desk, likely his destination to check the docket and keep updated on what was going on. "Where are you at?" "Lost track of them. They used bland asphodel." "Ah, and how did they notice you?" "Unclear." Terrace pursed his lips a moment. "Well, it happens sometimes." Nadia blinked. Had he really said that? "But don't let it happen again." There it was. "Yes, Spectre." "As far as I could tell from Chronicler's rather chatty," Nadia suggested. "Lengthy explanation on the matter. Necromancers are not usually particularly skilled in subterfuge and tracking." Terrace nodded at her, and then dismissed her before walking behind the front desk. Nadia turned and walked away before he changed his mind and called her back. If he suddenly wanted more details, she wasn't sure she could keep quiet about her mistakes. She was amazed she'd gotten away with it and still had time to right her wrongs. But letting the necromancers escape was one thing. Now Darrow had interfered, hindering her further in her mission. And why? Darrow hadn't known about the necros until he made contact with Nadia. Now he was abducting them, at least the one. To what purpose, though? It wasn't like he could control a necros. Only the creating necromancer could do that. A youthful voice sounded, reaching through the barrier of her hard-working mind. "Shadow?" Nadia turned to find a bolt a couple of meters away. She was in her late teens, soon to be promoted to shield. She gave Nadia a quizzical look, and Nadia realized she'd stopped in the middle of the common area, just standing there, thinking. "Yes," she said, refusing to explain herself. There's someone here to see you." Nadia turned fully toward the bolt. "Who?" "She didn't say." The bolt wrinkled her nose. "But she smells funny." Nadia turned her gaze toward the front doors in question, and the bolt confirmed it with a nod. The Wraiths didn't let visitors enter the premises without knowing them. By the time Nadia reached the doors, she had gathered her long hair in a thick braid. She went outside into bright sunlight reflected from the artificial sky above, and down the front steps before she stopped a few paces away from a now familiar figure. "Phoebe," she said in greeting. Phoebe stood a little hunched, looking unsure of herself, her baby in her arms, her eyes darting nervously between all the Wraiths coming and going. Being the daughter of a necromancer, she must have been taught to fear them more than most Agarthans. Nadia could smell the faint scent of rot on her, the more refined type, likely a side effect of living in Eluin's house. The baby smelled sweet, except for the hint of a wet diaper. "I'm glad you found me," Nadia went on, deciding that scaring the woman was not the way to go. She had said her name before Phoebe had screamed out her warning to the necromancers in the basement. Thankfully, she'd heard it and come looking. The reason why was unknown, but Nadia hoped she'd come to her senses. "I'm not here to help you kill my father," Phoebe said, and drew herself up a bit. "So much for that, then." Nadia lowered her brows and focused on the baby. "Do you want to raise him in that environment?" "That is none of your business, Shadow." "It is not," Nadia acknowledged, minding to keep her voice neutral and friendly. She did not want to scare Phoebe off when she had picked up the courage to come here of all places. "But I wonder if the baby's father would have wanted such a living arrangement for his child." She purposefully didn't mention Flynn's name so close to other Wraiths. A few of them had enhanced hearing like herself, and could pick up low-spoken chatting without trying all that hard. Phoebe seemed to be of a similar mind. She glanced around nervously. Then she gazed down at the sleeping child in her arms. The baby looked snug and healthy. "His father is dead," she said, her voice hard. "And he was never going to be a true part of our lives, was he?" Nadia shook her head. There was no point in trying to soothe the woman with lies when she was so clearly attuned to the truth. That would only anger her further. "I did not come here to talk about him anyway," she said, her face contorted in pain she couldn't quite hide. Nadia had no doubt Phoebe had genuinely cared for Flynn. His death had hit her hard, especially so soon after the birth of their child. "Then why are you here?" Nadia asked her. "You know I have to stop your father." "Kill him, you mean?" Nadia shook her head. "Not unless he forces my hand. He will have to face the Queen's judges, though, one way or the other. If he comes voluntarily, that is the better option for him." The same applied to the other necromancers, but Nadia assumed Phoebe didn't need that reminder. It was her father who truly mattered to the woman. If she had been raised in the house of a necromancer, then necromancy had likely been normal for her. Phoebe pressed her lips together at Nadia's explanations of Eluin's expected future. "I suppose that is better than what happened anyway," she said after a pause. "Something has happened?" Phoebe drew a deep breath and huffed it out. "I don't know who else to go to," she said, almost looking like she was being forced to eat a lemon. Nadia waited patiently. Wraiths were used to hostility in many variations. This wasn't even near the worst kind. "But I suppose this is the type of situation one goes to the Wraiths with," she went on. "Is your father in trouble, Phoebe?" Nadia asked. "Besides you hunting him?" Phoebe threw back at her. "Besides that," Nadia confirmed. "He is still an Agarthan and entitled to protection if someone has broken the Queen's law to harm him." Phoebe gazed at the sky a moment, closing her eyes and feeling the sun on her face. Then she refocused on Nadia with a heavy sigh. "I moved back home to my apartment." "I know," Nadia said. She had been keeping tabs on both Phoebe's home and Eluin's, but seen little of interest to help her track down Eluin. "I assume your father has been staying with one of the other necromancers." Phoebe's eyes widened in fear at this open use of the word. Again, she looked around, but the Wraiths out there didn't bother with them. If any of them heard, they knew this was Nadia's case and her responsibility. "Yes, he has. I would never have told you either. It's just that—" She hesitated, gently rocking the sleeping child in her arms, but then seemed to make up her mind. "They all stayed with Jeanette." "The female necromancer?" Phoebe nodded. "So, why are you telling me now? What happened?" "They were taken." "Taken? 4 necromancers and all their necros?" Nadia had experienced the strength, speed, and complete lack of empathy in the necros that had been Flynn. It took some serious force to handle them all. She looked Phoebe straight in the eyes when it dawned on her. "Were they taken by vampires?" Darrow had taken a necros right in front of her. Had he taken them all? If he hadn't actually left the area after their 10-minute truce, then he could have remained and seen the necromancers escape, and followed them the whole way from Eluin's home to their new hiding place. Nadia had, in a sense, handed him this new weapon on a gold plate. "They looked like werewolves to me," Phoebe said. "I was on my way there with some food last night, but I was some way down the street. No one paid any attention to me. They were all dragged outside, gagged and bound and stuffed into a truck." Truck? Darrow had a car at his disposal at Eluin's house. Access to 2 vehicles meant whoever he was dealing with had sufficient funds to keep this operation going, whatever kind of operation it was. They'd used a new type of weapon on her, too. She'd seldom felt so helpless as when blinded by the silvery light. Nadia didn't know what they were planning, but she knew Darrow was working with Casmer Temedius, an old and wealthy vampire, in whatever scheme this was. "One of them was a vampire, though," Phoebe said, oblivious to Nadia's thoughts. "Right," Nadia said. "Give me the address and I'll see what I can do." Phoebe hesitated again. "What about my son? What about him?" Nadia didn't smile but went for a friendly face. "What happens when they find out?" Phoebe whispered, indicating the dark figures walking past them in the sunlight. "Nothing that harms your baby. I promise." Phoebe's brows creased. "I almost believe you." "You should. The child is of no interest to the Wraiths. Your son is safe." "And Flynn? What about his reputation?" Nadia pressed her lips together and said nothing. Phoebe nodded in understanding and then shook her head before she decided to trust Nadia somewhat. She gave up the address to the necromancer's hideout. Within a minute, Nadia walked away from both the mother and her child, as well as the cube, finally a step closer to the necromancers. Unfortunately, if her suspicions were correct, also a step closer to Darrow. Chapter 11. Jade Mansion. It looked like a beautiful place, a townhouse, the home of a wealthy citizen. It was painted white with gray accents, and it had a well-tended garden out front which stretched around the house. Nadia sat still, doused in crushed-up bland asphodel, the anemoy newt inside the amulet hard at work, keeping her every breath and heartbeat inaudible for any creature of the night should they be nearby. She knew from experience that Casimir kept guards in the area around his home. She sat high up, half hidden behind a turret on one of the neighbors' townhouses. She hadn't needed to go by the address Phoebe had given her. All she had learned there was that Phoebe had told her the truth. The apartment where the necromancers had holed up had been completely trashed with upturned furniture and broken glass and porcelain everywhere. Nadia had not been surprised given her own experiences with the Necros, but Darrow and his cohorts had won out in the end, forcing the necromancers and their creations with them. They hadn't bothered using bland asphodel, leaving a faint trail of rot all the way to Jade Mansion. As far as Darrow knew, Nadia hadn't known about that hideout, and he'd been right. There had been no reason to think she'd follow them. Besides, he'd completely taken her by surprise at Elwyn's place before and after the ordeal with the rest of the necromancers. Darrow had been ahead of her the whole time. Hopefully not now, though. Nadia sat in her half-meditative state, paying attention to the comings and goings of Casimir's home. She'd even caught the guard change this time. Now that she knew of the use of werewolf guards, the seeming arrival and exit of visitors did not fool her. Now that she was aware, she could also spot the guard now and then, tracking his whereabouts from her hiding spot. She needed to enter Jade Mansion. That much was clear to her, despite how foolish it was to enter the home of an old vampire such as Casimir Temedius. The older they got, the stronger they often were. How else to survive in the cutthroat world of the vamps? Add in that Darrow lived there too, and walking into that mansion was a true fool's errand. But Nadia had blundered in her mission to stop the necromancers, and now they had been captured and imprisoned by Casimir and Darrow. It was bad enough what the necromancers did to the poor souls whose bodies they stole, but forcing them to do the same in the name of Casimir and his nefarious plans? Whatever those plans were, Nadia knew without a doubt that if someone got hurt because of it, she was to blame for not stopping the necromancers in the first place. It didn't leave her with many choices. One's own conscience could be a harsher judge than most people. She'd already spied the way inside. The few windows on the mansion were boarded up, the wood fused with the rest of the house and blending well. But up on the roof, a few small pitch vents had not been given this treatment. Nadia assumed this to be because the vampire inhabiting the mansion did not spend his daytime hours sleeping up there. She judged her time right and approached the building without a sound thanks to her amulet, taken off a guard keeping watch over this very place. She would have preferred to do this at night and be hidden by darkness, but a vamp's home was best broken into when he was sleeping. Still, she knew how to hide, and approached with care and no hurry, making sure not to be seen by anyone, especially the werewolf guard. When she entered the garden, she timed it so the guard was on the other side of the house. It was fairly easy from there on. She couldn't be seen from the boarded-up windows, but minded to keep hidden in case of spy holes. After that, it took 10 minutes of waiting for the guard to pass by on his round before she began her climb. It was arduous and risky, but took her only 5 minutes of careful maneuvering until she reached the first pitch vent. There she found she didn't need to force the lock open. It had rusted years ago and gave in to her tinkering with it. She climbed inside and closed it behind her, and then found herself in a cluttered attic. She remained where she'd landed on the floor a moment, taking it all in. Casimir had stored quite a lot of old weapons, armor, tents, various equipment, and old paintings up there. It was neatly placed along the walls and against each other, but the middle space was open to grant someone easy access to everything. Nadia stood and had to bend her head under the low ceiling. It was dark up there, but the light from the pitch vent provided her with enough to manage. Besides, her night vision was better than most. She easily found the door that led out of the attic. It threatened to creak, a noise her amulet didn't silence, but she managed by easing it open and then shut behind her. Nadia took a deep breath then and listened for anything at all. She was inside the house of Casimir Temidius, uninvited and not on official business to take care of him. As far as she knew, he had broken no laws, and she'd checked their archives and the docket to make sure. The vamp had not been in the Wraiths' eyesight before. All she'd found out was that he'd lived in Agartha for at least 100 years. It could become troublesome if her break-in came out. She knew it would become more than troublesome if Casimir found her himself. No, it was best to get this all over with before he awoke and found her trespassing. He already suspected her of killing his former guard. No need to get him more suspicious. When she was certain she heard no sounds or smelled anything amiss, Nadia began moving down in the mansion. Casimir was as wealthy as his home suggested he was. Nadia had seen a few examples of the rich in the city owning property, but having to sell off everything inside to keep up the pretense. This house was not one of those. Casimir liked his luxuries and colors. Every room she passed by or through was furnished with expensive furniture, and he had clearly traveled, judging by the artwork from other realms. Everything was tidy, too, almost like using the rooms meant sitting still and not touching anything. It smelled clean as well. Not once did she come across any mess, the smell of food, even cooked hours ago, or blood. Tidiness was the rule, and all she could pick up was that of soap and other cleaning supplies. It was all too big for one person anyway, but Nadia knew he didn't live alone. Darrow used a few rooms on the western side. She'd seen that herself, curious of him not having boarded-up windows. But then, Darrow wasn't a vamp like any other. Moving down a spacious hallway decorated with old magical woods paintings from what appeared to be the enchanted forest realm, Nadia stopped abruptly at the soft brush of moving air against her cheeks. Someone had opened a door. She glanced around, but there was nothing but closed doors throughout the hallway. Closed doors were a risk. She didn't know what lay beyond. A scuffle so soft no regular human could have heard it reached Nadia's ears. Someone was coming this way. Someone used to keeping quiet. Nadia retreated down the hallway and took a chance on a door there. She opened it and stepped inside a darkened bedroom, thankfully void of any creatures angered by her entering. Another sound from the hallway came so soon, she didn't have time to snap the door completely shut. Instead, she remained by the slit, only a few millimeters allowing her to see anything out there. But that was enough to discern the red-haired woman she'd spotted right after the UV bomb had gone off and killed Azir Neris. Nadia had seen she was a vampire and saw the telltale signs now, too, judging by her striking beauty and elegant movements. The vamp stopped by a door further down and rapped on it, hard and unapologetic. She even repeated it once but did not force her way in, showing Nadia she had enough respect for the person in there to not barge inside. The reason became clear moments later when Casimir Temidius's sleek voice floated out into the hallway. "Comrade, I was trying to sleep." It's not a compulsion to sleep during the day, Kamra, as her name had to be, answered, her voice slightly sultry, but mostly bored. She was right. A vamp could stay awake during the daytime if they needed to. What is it then? The smell. Cass, you have to do something about it. A necessary evil. Nadia couldn't see the male vampire, but she could see him wave his hand toward Kamra like her complaint was inconsequential. Every time I pass through your front door, it assaults my senses. How much longer? Not long, my dear. I will find a use for them. In the meantime, leave me to sleep while the sun is still up. Nadia saw the female vamp's eyes narrow, but she quickly dipped her chin and walked away, the same way she'd come. Casimir gave a deep sigh, and then closed the door to what had to be his bedroom. Nadia still didn't move. He was awake in there yet, and despite her camouflaged scent and hidden sounds, she wasn't taking any chances. She remained where she was, looking around the bedroom she was in. Upon closer reflection, it appeared to be a combined little office and bedroom. A guest room, perhaps? She couldn't fathom who'd wish to be a guest in this place. What interested her more, though, was the door on the other side of the room. Maybe that could lead her away from the hallway with an awake or drowsing vampire a mere few doors down. She did not want to engage Casimir. If it came out, and then at some point Atherton found the connection between Tricandis and the vampire, she risked being exposed for her past with him, and her current dealings with him. She hadn't reported a single one of them. It gave her the feeling that every lie she told, either directly or by omission, seemed to create new ones to keep the old ones going. She forced those thoughts away, and finally, after 10 minutes of waiting, closed the door she was standing by, so slowly and carefully that the final snap barely sounded at all. She waited even longer, but Casimir never came. He must have fallen asleep again. Nadia turned and headed for the other door. She listened carefully but heard nothing. She didn't smell anything either. As she opened it, though, light flooded through, bright and white, almost silvery. She frowned and opened the door fully. It wasn't hurting her. A larger room than the guest room revealed itself to her. This was no ordinary room in a mansion. It looked more like a lab with the workbenches all pushed against the walls. There were all kinds of equipment on them, from microscopes to test tubes and petri dishes. It sort of reminded her of Harmiston's lab, only half the size and with the one window in there boarded up from the outside. She glanced curiously at a pair of gas masks on the workstation nearest the door, but her attention was taken by the large tank of light? It rested on a pedestal in the middle of the room and had a rounded shape. Some wires connected to measuring instruments were lowered into the tank via a few holes on top of it. Nadia stared in confusion. She wasn't sure if it was light or some magic contained within. It looked silvery, reminding her of the flash of light Darrow had aimed at her in Elwyn's house, but it wasn't turning her blind. So what was it? She had no doubt it had some significance since it was being kept in a lab in the home of a vampire she knew was searching for new and effective weapons. She turned to search the workstations for clues. Maybe something would make sense in the numerous notepads scattered around, but she stumbled and caught herself. Nadia looked down at her feet. Odd. She didn't just stumble like that. She shook her head and focused on the nearest notepad again. The room felt a little swirly. She narrowed her eyes. She felt nothing wrong with her body, no nausea or tiredness. Why was she suddenly being so slow? She tried turning back to the silvery tank again, but fell, barely registering anything but the impact with the floor before her senses faded and she passed out. Chapter 12. Dangerous words intruded on what was a heavy darkness. Nadia instinctively knew something was wrong. "What are you hiding from me, Nadia?" The voice was familiar. Someone she trusted. No, She should not trust this voice. That knowledge was crystal clear to her. "I can't tell you," she said. Her voice came out funny. She was hoarse, and she slurred her words, almost like she'd been drinking alcohol. Wraiths never drank so much as to be weakened and in danger of attack. She would never do that. "So there is something. I knew it." The voice sounded saddened, more than outraged. She was sure it was a he. So familiar, that voice. "What did I miss back then, Nadia?" "Darrow," she mumbled, realization hitting her. She felt more aware now, like she was coming to via a lucid dream. A rapid knocking sound broke through her confusion. "Not now," Darrow mumbled. How had she ended up with him? The silver light? Nadia became aware enough to retreat within herself as her body fought to awaken properly. She must have breathed in something, some gas from that tank. Darrow had found her and was now asking dangerous questions. The knocking came again. "Why now?" Darrow hissed. Then she heard him sigh before he moved. His hands reached under her, and when he lifted her, her eyes fluttered, and she thought she saw a green couch before she was carried over a blue rug and then through a doorway. Darrow laid her down on something soft, a mattress. She was fully aware now, remaining limp on purpose, wondering what was going on. Darrow's steps retreated from the room, and he closed the door. Nadia snapped open her eyes. She lay in a large bed, the bedding soft under her. It smelled of Darrow. Voices sounded from the other room. He was talking to another man. Casimir. She recognized the voice. She was not interested in their conversation, though. Not now. She sat bolt upright, glancing around and then down at herself. She was in a large bedroom, richly furnished, and with a window that was not boarded up. The west side of the mansion, then. She must have been unconscious a long time because darkness had fallen outside. She was still wearing all her clothes, and most importantly, all her weapons and equipment. Darrow had done that once before, too, inside the shade, but she didn't know if it was because he'd been in a hurry, then and now, or if he didn't see her as a threat at all. Probably the latter, she thought, and got off the bed. Few people were a threat to someone like him. Nadia hurried over to the window, the sound of her steps completely muted by the amulet. It was still working and hung outside her shirt. Darrow must have noticed the chain around her neck and pulled it out to see, likely curious as to why he couldn't hear her heartbeats when she was obviously breathing. In a sense, Casimir had just saved her from having her useful magical trinket taken away by Darrow. She was sure he would have taken it given more time, especially since she'd stolen it from one of Casimir's dead guards. She was careful when opening the window, but the voices out in the apartment droned on, telling her she was in the clear for now. She doubted it would last long. The second Casimir left, Darrow would return, and Nadia did not want to be there for his questions. Instead, she climbed out the window into the darkness, knowing she would have a few precious handholds down to the floor below. Further down, there was nothing to hold on to, a precaution to prevent people from breaking in. But Nadia did not want to escape the mansion just yet. She needed to find the necromancers first. If Darrow was keeping her presence in Jade Mansion a secret from Casimir, then he was likely the only one who'd start searching the building for her. She forced open the lock on the window below Darrow's after listening a few seconds for any sign of life in there. She couldn't wait any longer, though, and simply had to enter before Darrow came back and looked outside when he found her missing. She entered another bedroom, tidy and clean. It smelled like no one had stayed in there in a while. She'd wondered about the werewolf followers Darrow had. Maybe they weren't as welcome in the mansion as he was. That meant some of them probably still lived in Calmont Hollow among Agartha's werewolf population. She made a mental note to warn Nilafar of this. She was respected in the werewolf community, despite having taken a social hit when her son was turned into a were-vamp hybrid. They should be on the lookout for these young and angry werewolves. Sneaking out of the bedroom, Nadia didn't hesitate in moving fast through other rooms and hallways, except to stop now and then to listen for movements nearby or smell the scent of someone. The mansion was large, but turned out to be fairly empty of life, the undead residents notwithstanding. But Nadia knew more or less where she was going. The red-haired vampire, comrade, had, in a way, told her this. The smell of rot permeated the ground floor, and Nadia's best guess was therefore to look in the basement. It made sense to imprison the necromancers, and especially their creations, there. According to the lore Harmiston had found, the necros fared better in damp and cool places, and it also limited the scent to the bottom of the mansion. Nadia was spurred on when she reached the ground floor, and the faint scent of rot reached her nose. From then on, she followed the increasing stench to find the sources of it. She was near the basement entrance when she heard the soft click of a door opening. Someone was fast approaching. Hidden from anyone's senses with both her amulet and the bland asphodel, she hurried to climb up a nearby coat closet, an ornate and monstrous thing. She pressed herself flat on top of it, thorned roses carved to decorate the top, hiding her from anyone who wasn't staring directly. A second later, Darrow came out from a door she hadn't been through herself. He entered the large foyer and walked past the elaborate central staircase. It was sure to steal every visitor's attention, as they were led upstairs by the light display of several crystal chandeliers above. Darrow went straight for the door far to the side, which Nadia had pegged for the basement entrance. She lay utterly still despite her added magical protection, and watched him prove her right when he opened the door and walked down some stairs. Nadia couldn't hear him very well. He moved with quiet grace, but she saw him disappear downward. She waited patiently, like any good wraith, not moving neither before he returned nor after. When he reemerged, he looked slightly puzzled. That was to say, he looked serious, a little manic like he always did, but there was a slight crinkle to his left brow, which gave him away to Nadia. She remembered that one little motion of puzzlement from when they were teenagers. He'd always done that when there was something he couldn't understand, something that didn't add up for him. He'd been sure Nadia would go to the basement. Hopefully he now thought she'd escaped the mansion. She watched him, moving nothing but her eyes while he walked over to the front door. He stopped there a moment and stood stock still, listening for any hint of her nearby, no doubt. But when he heard nothing he didn't expect inside, he opened the door and went out there to look. Nadia waited a full minute to climb down from the coat closet. She'd preferred more time to be certain she was in the clear, but one did not always have that. She hurried over to the basement door and slipped inside, closing it carefully behind her. The stairs led down to a cold and musty part of the house. Unlike the attic, which stored Casmire's old treasures, anything kept down here was less cared for. She also soon came to see what the space had mostly been used for. Agarthan children were warned from an early age of the dungeons of the city's vamps. When they grew older, they laughed it off as tales to keep them from joining the vamps as their voluntary snacks. Nadia, and the rest of the Wraiths, knew better. Once they'd served a few years, they ended up seeing a thing or two to give ordinary citizens nightmares. It was therefore no shock for Nadia now to discover the rows of small rooms converted to cells to imprison people and other creatures alike. Most stood open, giving her a look at the bare spaces which had chains installed to be used if necessary. Nadia didn't worry too much about who had been here or what Casmire brought in that needed those chains. Such worries were best saved for the meditative cleansing of her mind later. Now, she needed to act swiftly and get out of here, preferably together with the necromancers. The stench had reached foul levels when she found them locked in several dank cells in the innermost part of that section of the basement. Fresh air reached her then, and she sacrificed a few precious seconds to search out from where it originated. It led her down another corridor, crowded with stacks of empty and unmarked wooden crates. Something had been stored down here at one point, by a former resident of a less vampiric persuasion, perhaps? Nadia got the sense that food, and not blood, had filled the crates and a few empty rooms that looked like old pantries. She also discovered the reason for the small gust of fresh air mixed with the pungent smell from the prisoners farther back. It was a couple of narrow windows, or vents more like, just at ground level, which was 2 meters above the floor in the basement. The glass panes had been switched out with wood and metal, and looked more like hatches now, but they could still be opened. One even was open, revealing a slit which explained why this part of the basement didn't smell so shut in. Nadia considered this revelation. Was it possible to get the necromancers out this way? She didn't think so. One of the younger men and the woman were too big to get through the narrow gap. The necros were a different matter, but she had other plans for them. Giving up the narrow hatches as an escape route, she hurried to go back to the cells, the smell increasing and welcoming her back. She could hear the wheezing and hisses from the cell containing the necros. She focused on the cell containing the necromancers instead. She needed the necros since she couldn't use the hatches, and to use the necros, she needed their creators to take control of them. She went to one of the doors and got to work, certain she was in the right place since she could hear them talking in subdued voices in there. There was also the more pungent, yet chemical-like smell guiding her. Casimir had invested in secure locks, but not secure enough. The Wraiths were often tested, trained, and updated in the skills of picking locks. Soon, she heard the bolt click back and could open the door. "By the spirits!" the female necromancer uttered at the sight of Nadia appearing in front of them. Phoebe had called her Jeanette. She was imprisoned with Elwyn and the other two, and they all backed up against the farthest wall. Jeanette grabbed Elwyn's hand. "She's here to—" "I'm not here to kill you," Nadia interrupted her, guessing where she was going with this. They simply had little time. "But I can assure you that whatever the vampire of this house has planned for you, it's much worse than surrendering to the Queen's judges." The necromancers shared worried glances. "It's now or never," Nadia warned them. "Because anyone who wants to leave here must come with me now." That settled it for them. They nodded and followed her out with no trace of threatening intentions in their body language. Nadia made quick use of the other lock to let the necros out. "It will be easier to sneak out without our charges," one necromancer told Nadia. Charges? Was that what they called their victims, like they had the honor of taking care of them? "It's impossible to sneak out," Nadia said, focused on the lock. Nearly there. The hissing from within was increasing. Were the necros affected by the emotions of their creators? She thought the agitation came from their master's fears. "There's a powerful vampire inside the mansion, and another one out in the garden looking for trouble," she added, deciding that giving the details would only frighten them more. They did not need to know Tracandus was roaming the grounds looking for Nadia. "And there is a werewolf guard out there too," she went on to let them know they truly needed the necros. The lock gave in to Nadia. She heard the noises from the cell lessen and then jumped back when the door was opened from within. "What are we to do?" Elwyn asked. "Order them upstairs," Nadia said. "They must fight as long as possible and draw the vamps away from the foyer. Create all the confusion you can so we can leave through the front door." Nadia kept her eyes on the walking corpses who shuffled out from the cell, their bodies in various states of decomposition. She had to breathe through her mouth, and noticed the necromancers did not suffer such troubles. Nadia drew her sword and indicated the right direction with a nod. All necromancers, except Elwyn, followed close behind their creations, but he halted. "No!" he blurted at the sight of the last necros exiting the cell. "What?" Nadia looked back there, not understanding his worry. The last two necros were the female he'd awoken back in his own basement, and then the necros who had once been Flynn. There was something off about him now. It was a narrow space, and though it didn't react much to the female necros blocking its way, it moved faster, its dead stare on the room in front of it, not the corridor it had been ordered to go. "I didn't know they had this specimen here," Elwyn said, backing up fast. Of course you did, Nadia protested. He had sent the thing back to his house. You can sense it. You don't understand, Elwyn almost wailed as the female Necros left toward the corridor. The wheezing of the last Necros behind it increased. Nadia met Elwyn's gaze and saw the truth there before he shouted it. I can't control that one. None of us can. Chapter 13. The Necros that had once been Flynn awoke from its thoughtless stupor to thoughtless attack mode. Elwyn was closest, and Nadia leaped sideways, pushing him brutally aside. She barely had any attention for the man as he fell hard to the floor somewhere behind her, grunting in pain. The Necros was already charging. Nadia bent to avoid its viciously hard fists and tried swinging out of its way, but saving Elwyn had cost her a precious second. The Necros hit her side, and she stumbled inelegantly, barely stopping herself from falling. She had to take a few extra steps before regaining her balance, which meant turning her back on the thing. She could hear the sneer-like noises well enough, though, and they were not following her. She whirled around, sword at the ready, seeing the Necros approaching Elwyn. He was still on the floor, scuffling backward, fear screaming from his facial expression, but not from his mouth despite it being frozen open. Another hiss mingled with those coming from the Necros. Nadia glanced sideways, seeing the female Necros returning, moving faster than before. Elwyn might look terrified, but he was still in control of her and now sending her the wrong way. No! Nadia half shouted at him. She didn't want to draw attention from above, and even at this distance could she hear shouts from up there. Someone had discovered the other 3 Necros. Send it back up to help the others, she added to the frightened necromancer. She moved forward and swung her sword, slicing into dead flesh, leaving a dark cut from the middle of the back to the upper arm of the Flynn Necros. It didn't affect it at all, not beyond getting its attention. Do what I say, Elwyn, Nadia ordered without looking at the man. Her focus was solely on the Necros charging her. The dead eyes didn't even seem to see her, yet it veered right for her, harm the intent of the forces controlling it. It had been the same back in Elwyn's house. She'd prevented it from doing whatever it had been ordered to, and that had sent it into attack mode. The thing lived, if one could use such a word, to do its master's bidding. Nadia slid out of its reach and glided to the side, swinging her sword. She aimed for the head, but the Necros followed her move, twisting so the blade hit its shoulder. It did not elicit any cry of pain or force the beast to stop. It continued to charge her. She was barely aware of the female Necros having left, so at least Elwyn had listened to her. The remaining Necros had no attention for anything but to stop everything in its way. Fists flew, the reactions of the thing impressive. Nadia couldn't help wonder, as she parried flesh with her sword, if the highly trained and resilient body of Flynn made the Necros stronger than most. Despite the blatant signs of decomposition and the smell thrown her way with every move it made, it was in remarkably good condition. The wheezes continued, and Nadia tried to strike the head, yet the thing evaded her every move like it knew what she was attempting. But she had been close in Elwyn's house, ready to chop its head off when Darrow had interfered and stopped her. She thought back. What head? Her mind flashed with the memory of the Necros falling down the stairs, of the Necros fumbling up and down them too. It was clumsy despite blocking a blow from her sword now. Nadia swung her blade around, backed up a step to brace herself, and then struck low. The sword bit into the Necros's leg and nearly cut straight through, biting deep into the bone, breaking it. She ducked a ruthless blow, aimed at her head in her slightly bent position, and then yanked hard to free her blade. The motion unsettled the Necros, and it stumbled and fell when its leg couldn't hold its weight. Hisses mixed with the foul stench, and Nadia did not hesitate despite who the body had once belonged to. As the Necros turned its head toward her to keep fighting despite laying on the floor, she stabbed the blade of the sword right through its eye and into its skull. She saw all motion leave the thing then, yet pulled her sword out and swung it up high, and cleaved the head off with all her added half-breed werewolf strength. Flynn's body stilled completely. Nadia breathed a deep sigh of relief for taking care of the threat, but mostly for ending the desecration of a wraith. Screams from upstairs pierced through the silence, and everything around her flooded back to her consciousness. The screams were human. The necromancers. Elwyn was heaving for breath from the fright of an uncontrollable necros. Nadia swallowed down an angered remark about welcoming him to everyone else's world. Instead, she ordered him to stay put and ran after the necromancers. He was too afraid to do anything but obey. Nadia hurried through the corridors and back to the stairs. She knew the way by heart, having mapped it out in her mind when she walked down. But even if not, the stench again led her in the right direction. Sounds of fighting reached her ears and intensified in volume when she reached the foyer. She ran past the grand staircase, lit up in all its glory by the chandeliers, and soon found the source of the noises and shouts a few rooms in. What had probably been a lovely and elegant parlor a few minutes ago was now a mess of upturned furniture with both Casimir and Darrow, who'd come back inside, fighting the necros. The dead, yet moving bodies put up a vicious fight. Nadia stopped by the open doorway and saw one of the necros dead on the floor, as well as one necromancer. Casimir, like Darrow, had changed into his vampiric form, looking slightly better than the necros, since his pale and waxy skin wasn't rotting. He moved back from an approaching necros, and straight into another, the female necros. He whirled around and sliced his claws into its neck, dark gore oozing out of it. Then he jumped, or levitated more like, over a turned-over table and grabbed one of the necromancers. Casimir sank his fangs into the man's neck and he screamed, another necros approaching, probably the necromancer's creation ordered to help him. Nadia noticed Darrow giving the female necromancer the same treatment. The necros were hard to kill, especially so many at once, but the necromancers, trapped under the vamp's teeth, stood no chance. Neither did the one cowering in the corner with Casimir and Darrow between him and the door. The necros attacked, snapping their teeth and biting as well as hitting and grabbing the vamps. But these were powerful vamps. One necros fell to the floor, the spell breaking slowly when Casimir ripped part of the necromancer's throat out, blood dripping from his mouth. Then he turned on the last necromancer, stopping only to rip the head off the female necros who was in his way. Nadia backed away from the door then. There was nothing she could do here. She had not meant for the necromancers to be slaughtered, only the necros, killing 2 birds when distracting the vampires so she and the others could escape. That had been a miscalculation. The necromancers must have thought themselves powerful with their necros to fight for them. She ran back to the basement door, trusting completely in her amulet and the bland asphodel to hide her from Casimir and Darrow. She hurried down and through the corridors, back to Elwyn. He stood bent over like he was in agony when she reached him. "I can't sense her," he said, when he noticed Nadia. There was genuine despair in his voice. "It's not a her," she said, and took hold of his upper arm. "Follow me or you'll be dead like the others." "What?" "Now!" She didn't shout. She didn't dare. They were lucky if they had even a minute. Thankfully, Elwyn didn't argue, and he followed her further back to the hatches in the wall. She climbed out first and helped pull him through, all the while listening for any signs of the vampires finding them. Fresh air hit her like a beacon of hope, but she knew better. Elwyn finally crawled through, and she hauled him to his feet and ran through the garden, heading for the street. She knew the vamps would follow if they became aware. All she could hope was that the necros had lasted long enough to steal their attention for the time she needed. Elwyn followed her without protest as they jumped the fence and reached the street out front. All was quiet there, and she could see lights on in a few houses. She looked at the sky then. It was lighter than it had been when she awoke in Darrow's rooms. She'd thought it was late at night, but she must have been passed out longer than she'd assumed because she was certain the orange tint to the sky signaled that dawn was soon coming. Only a few more minutes. They turned into another street, broader and more open, when a shadow moved down the wall of a house 30 meters ahead. Nadia halted and threw her left arm out to stop Eluin, who hadn't noticed, and who didn't either until Casimir walked out onto the street and stopped there, glaring at them. He'd changed back into his human form, his handsome features no less threatening than the vampiric ones, especially with blood all over his face. "Nadia," he said, his voice not as silky as the last time she'd spoken to him. "Casimir." She drew her silver blade dagger with her left hand, still holding the sword with the right one. She'd need all the weapons she had against him. He was old and strong, not to be fooled. She might stand a chance with all her training and added strength, but protecting Eluin lessened those chances. Still, what else was there to do? "I should have known you'd follow that fool of a boy," he snarled. Nadia assumed him to mean Darrow. "I know your type," he went on. "Not one to let go, are you?" "He interfered with my case." "Yes, he did. And now all the necros are dead." Eluin made a whimpering noise at this, like that was the worst part of it all. "All the necromancers, too, except for this one," Casimir went on, and turned his cold eyes on Eluin. "You can't have him," Nadia said, making a point of stepping in front of Eluin. She meant it. She'd kill the necromancer herself before giving him over to Casimir to be used as a weapon. She hoped it wouldn't come to that, but she had a duty to the Queen and Agartha both. "Neither can you," Casimir said, and took a step forward. Then he seemed unsure, hesitating, and turning to look up at the sky. The first rays of the sun were coming through the reflected sky above, strong enough to harm vampires even below ground. Many could survive a little longer during dawn and dusk both, but only within the shadows of the tall buildings of the city. Nadia and Eluin stood in the middle of an open street. Casimir had to move so as not to be harmed. With a last look through narrowed and angered eyes, he ran back within the nearest buildings, back toward Jade Mansion. Chapter 14. Nadia pounded on the door to Phoebe's apartment, haste in her every move. She knew the place wasn't big from her last visit, and wasn't surprised to hear soft footsteps on the other side almost immediately. "Who's there?" the woman asked through the door. "It's your father," Eluin answered when Nadia gave him a pointed look. Phoebe opened the door, and the relieved smile on her face vanished the second she noticed Nadia in her black attire standing there with him. Nadia didn't care and entered the small home without an invitation, Eluin following close on her heels. They'd had a chat regarding the most necessary arrangements now, even stopped for a quick phone call to ask for help, and time was short. "You're all right," Phoebe said, the relief genuine in her voice. Nadia noticed the baby sleeping, swaddled and comfortable inside a green blanket on his mother's bed. He stirred a little at the shift in noise levels in the room, but remained sound asleep. He smelled clean and healthy, like any baby should. But there was something else. Nadia sniffed the air and turned toward Phoebe. "You no longer smell of rot," she said. Phoebe and her father both reacted to that with frowns. "Neither do you," Nadia told Eluin. She'd noticed it back in Jade Mansion. When was it? After his necros had been destroyed. "The stench, sort of chemical. It is a side effect of your connections to your necros, isn't it?" she asked and looked between them. "We prefer bond," Eluin said. "But yes." "Call it what you will, but it smells foul. I smelled a difference between the necros and yourself," she told Eluin. "But I thought it rubbed off on you, Phoebe, because you were living in your father's house. But it didn't, did it? That was the connection between you and Flynn's body. You brought him back. How could you?" Nadia couldn't quite help the accusatory tone in her voice, but Flynn had been a wraith. "He didn't know you're a necromancer, did he?" "He couldn't have. Nadia couldn't see how he would have had any kind of romantic entanglement with her if he had known. Elwyn looked slightly surprised, but how surprised could he truly be? He'd known about the Flynn Necros. He had performed a necromancer ceremony with his daughter's Necros, standing right there among them. "I'm not a necromancer," Phoebe said, despair in her voice. She was backing up against the sink in her tiny kitchen. "Not truly." She eyed her father. "You would never teach me. But I have the gift, and I—" She shrugged and clasped her hands in front of her. "I picked up a thing or two over the years. When Flynn died," her voice hitched at the mention of his name and death alike. "It was pure accident. I was walking toward the checkpoint I knew he was working at that day. But the Wraiths, they were frantic." Nadia suppressed raising an eyebrow at that. She had never seen a frantic Wraith in her life. But they must have been in a hurry. "I don't think they noticed me," Phoebe said. They would have. But they had likely not paid her any heed at that time with more important things going on. "But I heard the orders Shield Diamira gave. One of them had to report back to the cube that Shield Flynn." Her breath hitched again, and she drew a deep breath to steady herself. "That Flynn, my Flynn was dead." "So you went inside the shade to reanimate him?" Nadia asked. "Of course not," Phoebe huffed. She crossed her arms over her chest, defensively. "I only wanted to see if it was true. I tried following the other Wraiths, but I soon lost them in the shade." She visibly shuddered. Nadia nodded. Most people didn't go in there unless they had to for travel. "I kept going in that direction, though, and the rest of the Wraiths went hunting someone, or something. I found him then." Phoebe paused and swallowed hard. It was true. He had died, and we'd just had our baby. It wasn't supposed to be like this. But then the Wraiths came back before I'd had a chance to process and say my goodbyes, and I hid in panic. "I know what Wraiths do to people like us, especially inside the shade," she said, indicating herself and her father. Nadia didn't comment. No one had known about their necromancy activities. The Wraiths would have let her stay for the pyre and then escorted her out. They were cold, all of them, but not heartless. "When they lit the fire, I couldn't think straight, so I began the chant." She cast her father an apologetic look, which told Nadia he had never trained his daughter in this. "Flynn crawled out of the pyre and hid among some crumbled ruins of an old building. The Wraiths couldn't see it through the massive fire." There was silence in the tiny apartment. It explained why Elwyn hadn't been able to control the Necros. It had belonged to Phoebe all along, explaining her chemically rotten smell. It had been fainter in her than the others, but perhaps that was due to their year-long experiences. "That was not Flynn," Nadia finally said. "Flynn would have given his life to stop such a creature as that." "Don't you think I know that?" Phoebe burst out, waking the baby who started crying. She hurried past Nadia and lifted him and tried to calm him. "Why didn't you destroy it?" "You say it like you saw nothing of Flynn there." "Because there was nothing of Flynn there." "Dream all you like," she said, and eyed Elwyn. "There are no spirits inside those creatures. They are nothing but the desecration of bodies and an offense to those who used to inhabit them." "They are not desecrations. They are beautiful." Elwyn shut up abruptly when Nadia raised a hand to demand silence. He probably thought she was threatening to hit him. She didn't care. "We don't have time for this," she said. "I regretted it." Phoebe continued behind her, cradling her baby boy and rocking him gently. The baby's cries came weaker until he dozed off again, safe in his mother's arms. "He couldn't be part of our lives any longer. Don't think me so foolish as not to understand that. But after everyone ran from the house when you came, I returned here, and I had no one to help." "So you sent your Necros to your father's house to fetch your things?" Nadia asked. Phoebe nodded. "And then he didn't come back. I went to Jeanette's place to ask you about it." She looked to Elwyn. but all I saw was everyone being abducted. That's when I went to see you, Nadia." That admission elicited widened eyes and raised eyebrows on her father's face, but Nadia truly didn't have the time. "We only have until the sun sets, and we have much to do before then. Thank you for telling me this, Phoebe," she added. "What will happen now, then?" Phoebe asked. "We'll be killed, won't we? They only send shadows after the doomed, and you are a sole wraith working alone. Only the shadows do that." "Only if you fight us," Nadia said. "If you come voluntarily, the judges will handle it." "So prison at best, then?" Nadia nodded. "We have come to an agreement, though," Eluin said, his voice low and his gaze flickering with uncertainty in Nadia's direction. "We have," she agreed and looked at the baby. "I know Flynn would have helped you in any way he could. I could see how he loved you both in the photo at your father's house. But he would never have left the Wraiths." "I know," Phoebe said, stoic as always, but a crease of confusion on her brow nonetheless. "None of you leave. I suppose you wouldn't either if you'd had a child. It's how you're all trained and raised. I had no hopes." Nadia said nothing. She wasn't all that sure she would have stayed with the Wraiths, but with a were-vamp hybrid as her child's father, she had needed to hide Nell for other reasons. She'd had little choice but to stay and pretend nothing had happened. "What is your boy's name?" Nadia asked. "Kenelm," Phoebe said, and smiled down at the sleeping infant. "Flynn's middle name. We didn't want to be too obvious." "Of course not," Nadia replied deadpan. Phoebe's eyes snapped up to meet hers. "Your father will take the blame," Nadia went on. "What?" "It's for the best, sweetheart," Eluin said, not able to hide his worry. "No, it's not. You know what they'll do to you." "I do. And Kenelm needs his mother. This is the only way. The Wraiths already knows about your father. He has agreed to take the blame for Flynn in exchange for your and your child's safety." Phoebe stared open-mouthed between them. "You're a Wraith," she finally said. "What's in it for you?" Nadia shrugged, hiding her true emotions behind a blank mask. "I am only doing this for your little boy, Flynn's boy. I will spare his reputation, and your father will claim it was a coincidence that he came upon the pyre and saw his chance to reanimate a Wraith for his research." Phoebe said, and blinked her eyes several times. "No." Thankfully, Nadia was spared the short-lived discussion the woman would lose anyway, since that was when the expected knock on the door came. She left father and daughter to both argue and say goodbye, and opened the door to find Victoria and her new fiancé, Count Armin Elisatra, standing there. "Congratulations," Nadia said and stepped aside. "Apologies for not having time to say more on the subject." Elisatra smirked. "Somehow I think life with her," he nodded sideways at Victoria, "is going to be quite interesting." The pair came inside and looked around curiously. "Well," Victoria said, "your call was very brief and urgent, Nad. We came as fast as we could." "I appreciate it." Phoebe and Eluin stopped talking and eyed the newcomers with curiosity. Judging by Victoria and Elisatra's expensive clothing, they did not live in the neighborhood. Nadia briefly explained the happenings to the pair, chancing on involving them. She needed to get Eluin to the cube and into custody before the sun went down, and Casimir could restart his hunt. He could already have sent werewolves after them. With his resources, he could surely find out about Phoebe and use her the same way too. No, she and the child needed to leave the city, and after the debacle with Elisatra's son a few weeks back, he was the best to get her out and help her get established in another realm. Elisatra can get you out, and when Eluin is in custody for his crimes, his property automatically ends up in your charge. I'm sure it can be sold in her name and the funds given to her, exchanged into whatever currency she needs. She added the last part to Elisatra, who nodded and quickly instructed father and daughter on the practicalities. "Are you all right, Nad?" Victoria asked her, gently pulling her back a step, whispering, "Yes." I hope it's all right, asking this of you. Victoria smiled, took Nadia's hand, and squeezed it affectionately. Of course, that's the child of a Wraith. It needs help. Even if it was just any child, Nadia said. But yes. Victoria nodded. Thanks for trusting us both with this. Nadia eyed the Count. If that's the one you've chosen, then I have no choice, do I? Victoria chuckled. No, but it's a good thing. I promise. Nadia gave a faint smile because she didn't doubt her. Come on, Elwyn, Nadia said, and stopped halfway up the front steps to the cube entrance. There were many Wraiths around them, coming and going, but no one reacted to his presence. With his stench gone, he seemed like any other middle-aged man. Since he was also in the presence of a Wraith, he was nothing to worry about for anyone. There's not much more to it now, she added. He sighed and his shoulders sagged, but he followed her inside. Assured that his daughter and grandchild would be safe from Casimir and the Wraiths both, he had caused no trouble. Of course, he knew that without the Wraiths' protection, he stood no chance against Casimir and Darrow. They would get him back with little effort. Thankfully, by the time they'd left Phoebe's apartment, it was only midday. That meant they could breathe a little. Once in the royal palace dungeons, Elwyn would be safe. Even Darrow couldn't break in there. Hi, Nadia. Cade, the bolt manning the front desk, said in greeting when she approached and stopped there. What can I do for you? Case closed, she said. Number 13548. This is the necromancer. I need a transfer to the ghosts. If Cade was surprised at seeing someone as rare as a necromancer, he didn't show it. Nadia was pleased by his self-control. He would make a good shield wraith soon. He didn't even blink, merely nodded, and pushed his 2 long bangs out of his eyes before he reached for the leather-bound book containing the latest updates on any case. It always took a few hours before things were fed into the computers, since the technology wasn't their primary archive yet. Harmiston was probably the only person in the house who wrote directly into the machines. Spectre Terrace has given orders to be briefed the moment your case is finished. Nadia merely nodded and then turned and waved over the nearest bolt, a young boy, only 12 or 13, telling him to find the half-elf so she could get this over with. While waiting, she focused and controlled her breathing, making sure her pulse would beat a steady, though not too slow, rhythm. She was going to tell many lies, and a half-elf had the same excellent hearing as a werewolf or a vampire. It took no more than 5 minutes before he arrived at the front desk. Nadia noticed Elwyn, who by now was surrounded by 6 shield wraiths, shrink back a little at the sight of the big blonde warrior as he approached them. His cold, blue eyes quickly scanned the older man, and then focused on Nadia. You're done then? Nadia nodded. That is the necromancer? You said there might be more. 3 more. I've given the names to the bolt. She indicated Cade, who was still writing in the book. I took care of them. They attacked me. And the bodies? I was unsure of the protocol here, what with dead bodies rising. I destroyed them all. Thoroughly. The necros, too. Terrace nodded thoughtfully. Understandable. I take it this means Shield Flynn is put to rest? Yes, Spectre. Nadia knew the body she'd left behind was only a deteriorating and empty shell. Besides, vampires did not like the smell of the dead. They wanted fresh blood from the living. They would dispose of the body. Of that she was sure. What I don't understand is why he took the body of a wraith. He must have been doing this for a long time without being discovered. Nadia couldn't agree more. If Phoebe hadn't panicked, then they would still know nothing about the group of necromancers in their midst. They were so rare even the wraiths would have ascribed the stench to a broken sewage pipe or the like, should they have noticed at some point. You can ask him yourself, she told the Spectre Wraith. But the short of it is that Elwyn here took the chance on waking Flynn when he came across his body in the shade. He woke him and got him to move away before the flames consumed his body. He wanted to see if he could use a wraith against us or for protection somehow. At least that's what he's claiming. That was to say, it was what Nadia and Elwyn had agreed on as a motive before going to see Phoebe. Elwyn needed a story to protect his daughter, and that story would not involve Casimir or the infamous Tricandis. It would be too dangerous for him and his family, as well as for Nadia. She didn't know if she could trust him to keep to it, but she had no choice at this point. But necros are mindless things, Terrace pointed out. It didn't add up fully for him. True. I've seen that for myself now. Flynn was not inside the thing that walked around the city as a necros. Nadia felt her heart beating in its steady rhythm, her focus on Terrace, getting the story across and keeping her pulse calm. But as I'm sure Chronicler informed you, Terrace winced like he was reminded of something time-consuming. The goal of the necromancers is to bring the dead back like they once were, healthy bodies and sound minds. I believe that was his intention with Flynn, too. She quieted a moment and then told the absolute truth. But he failed. Terrace pressed his lips together a moment and then nodded. Good work, Shadow. He walked past her and over to the group of shields guarding Elwyn. Nadia didn't listen much to their words. She only waited while Terrace got the same story from Elwyn. When done a few minutes later, the Spectre Wraith filled out the necessary form for the shields and sent them on their way to escort Elwyn over to the royal palace and into the custody of the ghosts. There was no dungeon in the cube. The Wraiths did not imprison anyone. Their word was good enough, and Elwyn would stand no trial, only a sentencing. Death or imprisonment. That was the judge's decision, and the ghosts guarded the royal palace where all of that would take place. For the Wraiths, any job with an apprehended target ended at this point, which was why the sudden shouts from outside were such a surprise. Nadia turned and saw nothing from where she was. She'd walked away from the front desk when the shields had taken Elwyn back outside. She saw Terrace and Cade, though, on each side of the front desk. They were both staring out through the front door, the large glass panes in them allowing an excellent view of the street out front. When Terrace stepped forth and drew his short sword from the scabbard strapped to his back while simultaneously signaling for the bolt to stay where he was, Nadia drew her sword and began moving back toward them. She saw Terrace run outside and sped up to do the same. A scream pierced the air as the door was wrenched open. Someone was in deep distress out there. Shouts rose then, the steady and focused shouts of the Wraiths. She could hear metal hitting metal and cursed herself for being so far from the door. When she finally burst through it, 2 seconds later, the scene below would have stopped her short if not for all her years of training. Elwyn lay sprawled on the ground, his throat ripped open. The 6 shield Wraiths were all focused on the vicious fighter trapped between them, swinging her sword and meeting their attacks head-on. She was fast, keeping them at bay. Terrace reached the group right before she almost cleaved a shield's head off, but his sword blocked her attempt at the last possible second. The shield fell back a little and Terrace joined the others, his sword swinging just as fast as the vampires. Comrade! Nadia was sprinting down the front steps while seeing this all unfold. It was the same red-haired vamp she'd seen after Nyrus's death and in Casimir's home. The lower part of the vampire's face was dripping with blood. She must have taken the shields by utter surprise. A niggling thought protruded through the back of Nadia's mind. This vampire was out in daylight. Several Wraiths were approaching to aid the shields and Terrace. Comrade noticed and swung under the blades of 2 shields, gliding past them and out from the circle they'd formed around her. A wicked grin touched her bloody lips then. She was pleased with herself. Just when Nadia reached the fighting crowd, Comrade changed form, her athletic and light body growing, expanding, until the bipedal and muscular shape of a werewolf rose before them, larger than most wares. Her clawed paws dropped the sword and lashed out, just as deadly as the blade she'd given up. The shields had enough to do with simply escaping the unforgiving claws and sharp-toothed maw of the werewolf. 2 were hit, but Nadia saw them twist and avoid those claws. They still hit the ground with impressive force. The werewolf saw her opening and bounded away before anyone else could get close enough to attack again. It was the downside of so many attackers on one foe. The wraiths all stilled, staring after the werewolf, a few shields further away having the wherewithal to try to follow her. But Nadia knew then and there that they wouldn't find her. "A hybrid," Terrace said. Nadia and the other wraiths turned toward him. "Another hybrid," the specter repeated. "I saw her vampire fangs as I approached." "It's true," one of the shields said, and pointed down at Eluin's lifeless and bloody body. "That's how she killed him." "Have you seen her before?" Terrace asked Nadia, who stared at Eluin in numb silence. He hadn't deserved this. At the specter's question, she looked up, though. Her heart beat fast now, but she could hear from the crowd around her she wasn't the only one after this attack. "Yes, at Neris's death," she said truthfully. She had informed Atherton of that vampire after all. She now also suspected this was the female werewolf Diamira and her shields had come across inside the shade when so many of them had been injured. There was no hiding these things. But then she lied and shook her head for emphasis. "I don't think this had anything to do with him." Nadia indicated Eluin, wishing she could tell him she was sorry. She had tried to help him as best she could, but it hadn't been good enough. "Then this is a message," Terrace concluded. "We've been hunting Tricandus all this time, thinking he was the only abomination in the city. But there is another. 2 hybrids." That was not the message behind this at all. It seemed Casimir had been as serious as Nadia when stating that the other side couldn't have Eluin. He had sent Comrade to make sure his threats were made real before it was too late, and now Eluin had paid the price. "By the spirits," Terrace said, and waved the various wraiths around him closer to give his orders. "We are in for it now." Nadia nodded, wishing she could tell him how right she of all people knew he was. Chapter 15. There was a sense of trepidation in the air. Nadia walked down the main stairs inside the cube, sensing it like it was a tangible thing. She looked around the spacious common area, but saw nothing in the behaviors of her fellow wraiths. Of course, she expected nothing other than calm and stoic conduct, but they all knew it. There was more than one hybrid in Agartha, and that threat was an unknown. They all knew it would take a lot, but not exactly what, to take out this threat and protect the Queen's city. Nadia noticed Atherton sending off a group of shields into the night, her sensitive ears picking up his almost hidden sigh as he watched them go. His case had suddenly gotten worse since the attack earlier that day. He noticed Nadia watching and waved across the space between them. She returned the gesture, her face conveying her sympathies for his task. Then she walked further down until she entered the library. She circumvented the assistant chroniclers, which was easy enough since she could only hear their despairing voices from behind some bookcases with a large number of pink bubbles floating up into the air. Harmiston was in his lab, finishing up something with another shadow, who passed her in the doorway. "Nadia," he said, and smiled when she entered. "Interesting case?" she asked and indicated the retreating shadow. "The vampires are fighting to take Neris's place as leader. One of them decided that abducting humans for food bribes was a good idea." He shook his head and stacked some books on one of the workstations together. "He will soon find that it was a very, very bad idea." He placed the books neatly on top of each other and then focused on her. "I heard you found your necros and ended it." Nadia nodded and came further into the room. "I did. Flynn's body is no longer under the control of any necromancer." "Good. So what can I help you with? New case?" Nadia gazed at all the books and magical items and potions placed around the lab. It was unusual for a chronicler, but he'd settled in nicely and made the space his own. "There's always a new case," she said. "But no, I'm here to help you." Harmiston crinkled his brows. "You are?" Considering all her lying and deception lately, was it bad of her to notice and care about him not looking disappointed? "Yes. Spectre Terrace told me to update you on anything I learned of necromancers and necros both, in case someone else ever comes across any." "That is sound thinking from the Spectre," Harmiston said, and headed over to the computer he'd relocated from the library front desk to his lab. He booted it up, and then spent the next half-hour typing in Nadia's descriptions of, and experiences with, Agarthan necromancy. It wasn't an uplifting subject, and yet, despite minding her words so as not to reveal too much to him, Nadia felt a sense of relief akin to her meditation in talking it out with him. Like going through the horrors was cleansing her mind and readying her to move on to new cases. Only when Harmiston finished typing and got up did she notice how close she'd moved toward him. Again. She felt drawn his way lately, trusting him more and more, not merely being amused by and enjoying his loquacious company. Yet again, she was close enough to feel his body heat radiating toward her, and he smelled so good. She wanted to remain that close and not lose the connection. Harmiston froze momentarily when he noticed, his mind torn away from his scholarly work. Nadia wanted to sigh. She needed to back up again, but this time Harmiston didn't utter anything to break the spell. Instead, he remained still, except for his hand. He gently brushed his fingers against her cheek, sending shivers through her body. Then he leaned in and kissed her. Nadia didn't step back or break the kiss. She didn't want to do that. She wanted this. Harmiston's lips kissing hers. So she reciprocated, her lips gliding against his. His hand slid on into her hair, which hung loose before he embraced her properly and pulled her closer. She breathed in his scent, tasted him, immersed herself fully in him, brushing her hand through his short, soft hair, messing it up a little and not caring beyond loving the feel of it. She loved the feel of all of him, wondering why she'd been trying to stay away from the heat spreading from their lips and everywhere. "I've wanted to do that since the day you showed up and knocked my books out of my hands," he said, his voice husky when he pulled back a little. "Really?" She dusted playful kisses on his lips. "Yes." He rested his forehead against hers and sighed. Nadia smiled then, truly smiled, wide and freely, simply because she felt like it and didn't have to keep it inside. "I didn't think Wraiths ever smiled without gluing their lips together," Harmiston said, stroking one hand up her back and resting it above her neck, cradling her head. "You're a very hard group to read, hence my hesitation in doing this. But now that I did, I'm not regretting it." "Harm?" She interrupted him, still smiling. "Yes?" "Stop talking." She leaned in and kissed him, his lips answering hers immediately, melding together, kissing deeper, breathlessly. A young voice intruded, surprising even Nadia, who had heard no one approach. All she could hear was Harmiston's heartbeats, his few breaths, her own sigh, almost like a moan. "Shadow Nadia?" This time she sighed in frustration and turned her face away from Harmiston, yet she didn't let go of him any more than he did of her. "Yes?" she said, catching a young bolt's shocked and intrigued eyes. The girl looked a mix of embarrassed, an emotion she needed to throw aside as a wraith, Nadia thought, and curious. "Spectre Terrace sent me. He says there is a new case for you. Vamps." Nadia told her she'd be right up and waved her off. "I suppose the line of succession at Nightworth is providing new cases for all of us," she muttered and looked up at Harmiston, her smile back, though a little exasperated this time. "Well, you did warn me," he said, and cupped her cheek again, stroking his thumb along her cheekbone. "There's always a new case for a wraith." "I did do that," she said. "And you know where to find me," he added and let go of her, his smile warm and inviting. She glanced around the lab. Yes, she did. Somehow it felt like he'd always been in there, waiting for her. She gave him a quick nod and then left him there to find out what the Spectre Wraith had in store for her next. This has been City of Forbidden Beasts. Book 3 in the Queen's Wraith series. Written by G.K. Lund. Copyright 2022 by G.K. Lund. Audiobook production copyright 2025 by G.K. Lund. If you want to be notified of other audiobooks by G.K. Lund, remember to click subscribe. That way you won't miss new additions to this YouTube catalog.